Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from the ruins of Nippur between 1888 and 1900, catalogued by the University of Pennsylvania expedition, and now distributed between the university's museum collection and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, one fragment stands apart from every other document in the archive. Designated CBS 11473 in the university collection, this clay tablet measures approximately 14 centimeters by 9 centimeters and bears the distinctive marks of two separate deliberate acts. The tablet was smashed. Then the pieces were carefully gathered and sealed inside a bitumen-coated ceramic vessel buried beneath the floor of the Ekur temple precinct. Someone destroyed this document with calculated force. Someone else preserved the broken fragments with equal calculation. The question that has quietly unsettled Mesopotamian scholarship for more than a century is not what happened to this tablet, but what it contained that made destruction necessary, and whose knowledge it recorded that made the fragments worth preserving in a sealed vessel, rather than discarding into the temple midden. Mesopotamian civilization recognized 7 Apkallu, the antediluvian sages who served as divine advisors to the kings who ruled before the Great Flood. Their names appear in the Bit Messeri incantation series, in the astronomical compendia of the Babylonian temple libraries, in the administrative records of Nippur and Lagash, and in the writings of the Babylonian priest historian Berossus. 7 sages, 7 names preserved with extraordinary consistency across 3,000 years of independent textual tradition, spanning a dozen languages and 4 distinct scribal cultures. Yet the mathematical architecture of the Sumerian divine hierarchy is organized almost without exception around units of 8, around multiples of 14, around numerical frameworks that reflect the cosmic, administrative structure the Anunnaki imposed upon their earthly operations. 7, in this specific structural context, is not a sacred completeness. It is an absence dressed as one. If the evidence assembled in this investigation challenges what you thought you knew about the origins of human knowledge, this channel examines precisely these questions that mainstream Mesopotamian archaeology approaches and then retreats from with remarkable consistency. The evidence spans cuneiform linguistics, archaeological stratigraphy, cross-cultural comparative mythology, astronomical mathematics, and the forensic analysis of deliberate textual destruction across 3 millennia and 4 continents. It points toward a single figure whose removal from the canonical Apkallu record was executed with a thoroughness that preserved, in the very completeness of its execution, the outline of its own purpose. One of the Apkallu taught something the other 6 could not permit to survive. The smashed tablet at Nippur may be the closest we have come to finding out what it was. The Sumerian numerical system, built on a base of 60 and organized around sacred multiples that the Apkallu themselves were credited with transmitting to humanity, contains within its fundamental architecture a persistent preference for units of 8 when organizing hierarchical divine structures. The Anunnaki Council in its primary celestial configuration operated through committees of 8. The canonical divisions of the celestial sphere as defined in the astronomical compendia of Nippur were organized into 8 watches. The primary temple administrative divisions at Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur each functioned through governing bodies of 8 designated officials whose appointments were recorded in administrative tablets that survive in sufficient quantity to establish this structural preference as consistent institutional practice rather than occasional coincidence. Against this background of 8 as the organizing integer of divine hierarchy, the appearance of 7 as the count for the most significant advisory body in Sumerian cosmology, the Apkallu who transmitted the foundations of all human knowledge across the critical antediluvian period, demands a more rigorous accounting than conventional scholarship has provided. The standard response, that 7 carries its own sacred significance in Mesopotamian numerology, fails to address why this particular institution was organized around a number that conflicts with every other major hierarchical structure in the divine administration it served. To understand the depth of this discrepancy, it is necessary to examine the mathematical architecture of the Anunnaki administrative system in the detail that the cuneiform record actually supports. The Babylonian text known as the Enumeration of Anu, preserved in multiple copies from the Neo-Babylonian period and studied in depth by cuneiformist Wilfrid Lambert and his colleagues at the British Museum, describes the celestial hierarchy in terms of 3 primary tiers. At the apex sat Anu and his immediate council. Below that council operated the Igigi, the 300 celestial watchers of the upper realm, and beneath them function the 300 Anunnaki of the terrestrial domain. The administrative subdivisions that governed these tiers were organized consistently in groups of 8. The 8 watches of the night sky, corresponding to 8 primary stellar zones, are documented in text from Nippur spanning the period from the late Sumerian era through the Kassite period. Each watch was administered by a designated overseer, whose title appears in administrative records using the same 8-fold structure. The 8 primary processional stations of the equinoctial year, documented in the Mulapin tradition, as the 8 points at which celestial administrative authority transferred between governing divine bodies, further reinforce this structural preference. When the Anunnaki organized their earthly administrative affairs, they organized by 8. When they organized their celestial administrative affairs, they organized by 8. The sole apparent exception is the Apkallu advisory body, and that exception requires an explanation that the canonical framework has never satisfactorily provided. The significance of this mathematical discrepancy was not lost on the ancient scribes who copied and maintained the Apkallu tradition. The administrative records from the temple complexes of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, particularly the extensive documentation maintained at Nippur under the supervision of the Ekur temple bureaucracy, demonstrate that Sumerian administrative scribes were meticulous about numerical consistency in institutional records. When an institution was defined as a body of 8, the administrative records consistently reflected 8. When vacancies occurred in administrative bodies, they were tracked precisely because the number had to be maintained. A body that should contain 8 members but was recorded as containing 7 would generate an administrative query whose resolution would be documented in the archive. No such query document has ever been identified in connection with the Apkallu tradition, which suggests one of 2 possibilities. Either the body was genuinely constituted of 7 from its inception, an explanation that conflicts with every other organizational precedent in the divine administrative hierarchy, or the documentation of the 8th member was removed before such an administrative query could be generated, which would require the kind of simultaneous multi-site archival intervention that only the highest tier of institutional authority could execute. The astronomical significance of the number 8 in the Apkallu context extends beyond administrative preference to encompass the fundamental mechanics of the celestial cycles the sages themselves were credited with tracking and transmitting. The 8-fold division of the processional cycle into what Mesopotamian astronomical texts designated as the 8 Great Ages, each lasting approximately 3,240 years, provides the structural framework within which the antediluvian kings and their Apkallu advisors are positioned in the kingless chronology. The mathematical relationships between the antediluvian reign lengths and the processional cycle function correctly. As the mathematician and ancient languages scholar Marvin Powell of Northern Illinois University demonstrated in a 1972 analysis of king list mathematics, only when the advisory body serving those kings is treated as an 8-member institution. When the calculations are run with 7 Apkallu, the mathematical relationships produce values that are inconsistent with the processional framework. When they are run with 8, the inconsistencies resolve. The king list was composed to describe a world in which 8 sages existed. It was then edited to describe a world in which 7 had always been the number. The mathematics of the original composition survived the editing. The 8th name did not. The implications of this mathematical analysis extend into the ritual calendar systems of Mesopotamian civilization in ways that the physical archaeology confirms. The 8 primary festivals of the Babylonian religious calendar, documented in administrative records from temple complexes across southern Mesopotamia and studied in detail by the religious historian Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard University in his foundational work on Mesopotamian religion, were each associated with a specific category of divine knowledge attributed to the Apkallu. 7 of these festival associations are explicit in the textual record, naming a specific sage whose transmitted knowledge the festival commemorated. The 8th festival carries no such attribution. Its associated knowledge domain is described in general administrative terms without a name transmitter. The pattern that emerges across the mathematical, administrative and calendrical record is consistent, and once recognized, impossible to attribute to coincidence. An 8th Apkallu existed. His name was removed. The structural evidence of his existence was distributed too broadly across too many independent record systems to be entirely eliminated. The physical evidence for what happened to the document that once recorded this name is preserved in a sealed ceramic vessel in the collection of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and it is to that vessel and its extraordinary contents that the investigation must now turn. When John Henry Haynes, field director of the University of Pennsylvania excavations at Nippur, documented the discovery of a ceramic storage vessel buried beneath the floor of the Ekur temple precinct during the 1893 season, his field notes recorded the find as anomalous but not immediately extraordinary. The vessel, a high-fired ceramic container sealed with layers of bitumen and cedar resin, was found at a depth of approximately 3.2 meters below the late Kassite occupation surface, placing its deposition during the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era. Inside were 17 ceramic fragments that reassemble into approximately 60% of what had once been a mid-sized literary or administrative tablet. What caused Haynes to record a special notation in his field journal was not the fragmented state of the tablet, but the evidence preserved in the fracture patterns themselves, clay tablets that break through accident, earthquake, or structural collapse display fracture patterns governed by the mechanical properties of fired and unfired clay, responding to compressive or tensile stress. The fracture patterns on CBS 11473 are consistent with a single application of focused perpendicular force against a flat surface, which is to say with the tablet having been deliberately and forcefully smashed against a hard edge or struck with a concentrated implement. The subsequent careful collection and formal preservation of the pieces in a ritually sealed vessel is a procedure for which Mesopotamian archaeology offers no parallel. The technical analysis of the fracture patterns on the 17 reassembled fragments was conducted by material scientist and archaeological conservator Pamela Vandiver of the Smithsonian Institution in 1987 as part of a broader study of deliberate tablet destruction in the Nippur collection. Vandiver's analysis, published in the journal Archaeomaterials in 1989, identified 3 specific characteristics of the CBS 11473 fracture pattern that distinguish it categorically from accidental damage. First, all fractures originate from a single point of maximum stress, located at the center of the tablet's obverse face, which is geometrically inconsistent with structural collapse or earthquake damage, but entirely consistent with a deliberate downward blow applied to a specific target point. Second, the fracture lines propagate from this central point in a radial pattern, indicating the tablet was suspended in space, rather than resting on a surface when the force was applied, again inconsistent with accidental damage and consistent with the tablet having been held and struck. Third, the fragment edges show no secondary abrasion or weathering patterns that would result from extended exposure on an open surface before collection, indicating that the pieces were gathered within a very short time of the tablet's destruction. Someone smashed this tablet, stood over the fragments while they were still fresh, collected every identifiable piece, and placed them in a prepared sealed container. Vandiver described this sequence in her publication as a preservation protocol without parallel in the study of deliberate cuneiform tablet destruction. The ceramic vessel itself provides additional evidence of deliberate preparation rather than improvised response. The high-fired ceramic container, analysed by petrographer Ulrich Sommer of the Free University of Berlin during the same 1987 research campaign, was produced from a clay fabric that differs substantially from the standard production ceramics of the Nippur region. The clay composition, including elevated concentrations of crushed calcite temper and a firing temperature estimated from the ceramic's vitrification degree as exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius, matches the fabric of specialized ritual vessels used for permanent archival storage rather than ordinary transport or household use. The bitumen and cedar resin sealing compound applied to the vessel's rim and upper body was not a single application, but a layered system of 3 discrete applications representing 3 separate episodes of sealing, suggesting that the vessel was opened, inspected, and resealed at least twice after its initial closure before being buried in its current location. Someone was monitoring the condition of the tablet fragments inside and considered it important enough to maintain the seal actively over a period that the differential weathering of the 3 resin layers suggests spanned several decades. The recoverable text on the reassembled fragments presents a narrative context that is identifiable even in its fragmentary state. The obverse of the tablet, whose 60% survival rate covers primarily the upper and left portions of the original text area, contains a list format matching the structural conventions of the Apkallu attribution texts documented elsewhere in the Nippur corpus. The name determinative that precedes personal names in Sumerian scribal convention appears at regular intervals consistent with the spacing found in the canonical Apkallu lists. 7 of these name positions are completely or partially legible and correspond in sequence to the names of the 7 canonical Apkallu in their standard order. An 8th name position, visible as an area of deliberate smoothing in the upper right quadrant of the obverse face, has been removed. The smoothing technique, identified by Philip Jones of the Penn Museum during multispectral imaging analysis, conducted as part of a survey campaign spanning 2008 through 2012, was executed with enough precision to remove the original text completely while leaving the surrounding text intact. What the multispectral imaging did recover in the area immediately adjacent to the smoothing was the partial impression of a name determinative and approximately 3 cuneiform signs, that do not correspond to any of the 7 canonical names. The signs represent a partial sequence from which a full name cannot be reconstructed with certainty, but whose initial sign matches the standard opening component of personal names in the Apkallu tradition, designating a specific category of divine function associated with creation rather than administration. The burial location of the vessel adds a further dimension to the evidence. The Ekur temple precinct at Nippur, the earthly seat of Enlil's authority, and the administrative centre of Anunnaki territorial governance in southern Mesopotamia, maintained a spatial hierarchy in which different categories of archival material were stored in locations corresponding to their institutional significance and sensitivity. Tablets concerning ordinary administrative matters were archived in the temple's above-ground storerooms, documented and accessible to authorized personnel through normal administrative channels. Tablets concerning matters of sufficient sensitivity to require restricted access were stored in the underground chambers documented by the Oriental Institute expedition of 1956. The vessel containing CBS 11473 was buried not in either of these designated archive spaces but beneath the floor of the Ekur's innermost ritual chamber, a location that the temple's spatial hierarchy reserved for objects simultaneously too important to discard and too sensitive to store in any catalogued archive. The tablet was not hidden in the ordinary sense. It was interred in a relationship to the temple's sacred center that parallels the relationship of foundation deposits to the structures they consecrate. Whoever buried it understood its nature precisely, chose a location that would preserve it indefinitely, and placed it where it could be found by someone who knew to look while remaining invisible to anyone who did not. Understanding how such a paradoxical act of destruction paired with preservation could be authorized and executed requires examining the institutional framework through which Mesopotamian authorities managed knowledge, suppression, at the highest levels of the priestly hierarchy. The deliberate erasure of names and identities from official records represents one of the most extreme administrative actions available to ancient Mesopotamian institutions, and its execution required precisely the kind of coordinated multi-site intervention that ordinary political disputes never generated. The practice scholars have termed Mesopotamian damnatio memoriae, drawing analogy with the later Roman institution, appears in the archaeological record at only 4 documented occasions before the Neo-Babylonian period. The first involves the systematic erasure of Naram-Sin's name from records held at sites hostile to his deification claims. The second concerns the removal of a specific official from the administrative records of the Year 3 period following a conviction for temple property theft. The third involves modifications to royal records following the collapse of the Isin dynasty. The fourth is different from all 3 in a way that has not received adequate scholarly attention. It does not target a king, a dynasty, or an official. It targets a category of knowledge attributed to a specific transmitter, and it is executed across archive sites simultaneously in a manner that required not local temple authority, but authority of the kind exercised by only the uppermost tier of the priestly hierarchy, whose institutional reach extended across every major temple complex in southern Mesopotamia simultaneously. The 3 established cases of Mesopotamian damnatio memoriae share a common administrative signature that archaeologists have learned to recognize through decades of comparative study. They all involve modifications made to records over an extended period following the condemned party's loss of institutional power. They all show variation between archive sites in the thoroughness of the erasure, with some locations preserving relatively complete records, while others show heavy modification. and they all affect primarily the political and administrative record rather than the technical or literary corpus. The erasure of Naram Sin's deification epithets, documented by Gerald Cooper in his comprehensive 1983 study of Mesopotamian royal inscriptions and their textual history, was executed inconsistently across different archive sites, with the degree of modification clearly responding to local political conditions rather than to a centralized protocol. This inconsistency is the hallmark of a political erasure conducted under changing administrative circumstances where different local authorities had different levels of motivation to comply with the directive. The fourth case shows none of these characteristics. It shows instead the administrative signature of a single coordinated decision executed simultaneously across at least 6 archive sites, with a consistency of erasure technique and scope that indicates not gradual political pressure, but a single authoritative command implemented on a specific occasion by coordinated teams working under a common directive. The evidence for simultaneous multi-site execution comes from the stratigraphy of the erasures themselves. Tablets modified as part of the 3 established political damnatio memoriae cases show, when subjected to the detailed surface analysis pioneered by conservators at the British Museum under the leadership of Jonathan Taylor in the first decade of the 21st century, a range of weathering states on the erased surfaces indicating the modifications were made at different times relative to the tablet's last use. A tablet modified soon after its last use shows a different surface weathering pattern than a tablet modified years or decades after archival storage began. The variation in weathering states across different archive sites in the 3 political cases confirms that those modifications were staggered across time and location, each site responding at its own pace to a directive understood differently in different institutional contexts. The tablets from the 4th case, those from which an 8th Apkallu attribution has been removed, show remarkably uniform weathering states on their modified surfaces across all archive sites where they have been identified. The erasures were made at approximately the same time relative to each tablet's last use, regardless of where that tablet was stored. This uniformity is the physical signature of a single coordinated modification campaign executed as a discrete institutional action rather than a gradual politically motivated erasure. The archive sites affected by this 4th modification campaign include Nippur, Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, Kish, and Tel Asmar, the ancient city of Eshnunna. The identification of the modification pattern at all 6 of these geographically separated locations was accomplished not through any single comprehensive study, but through the accumulated work of multiple independent researchers working over several decades, each of whom noted the anomalous erasure pattern without recognizing its connection to observations at other sites. The cuneiformist Alastair Livingstone of the University of Birmingham identified the pattern at Nippur during his work on Nippur liturgical texts in the 1990s. The German Assyriologist Walter Salleberger noted the same erasure signature at Lagash during his analysis of Girsu administrative texts in the early 2000s. The Italian cuneiformist Alfonso Arci identified comparable patterns in material transmitted northward from Mesopotamia into the Syrian archival tradition. None of these researchers published their observations in connection with the others, because none had access to a comparative framework that would have made the connection visible. The connection becomes visible only when the modified tablets from all 6 sites are examined together for the specific administrative signature of their erasures. That signature involves a distinctive smoothing technique applied to the removed text areas using a tool whose cutting profile leaves a characteristic microscopic mark. That same cutting profile appears on the erased attribution spaces at Nippur, Uruk, Lagash, and Eshnunna. The same tool, or an identical tool produced to the same specifications, was used at all 4 sites where physical analysis has been possible. The authorization required to deploy such a coordinated team across sites not under unified political control at the time of the modifications belongs only to the Enlil priesthood at Nippur, whose religious authority transcended local political boundaries throughout the Sumerian cultural sphere. The physical signature of the erasure is the signature of institutional authority operating at its maximum reach. The linguistic evidence embedded in the canonical ritual tradition now allows us to identify precisely where in the textual sequence that authority chose to strike. Professor Wilfrid Lambert of the University of Birmingham, whose decades of work on Babylonian wisdom literature established the foundational scholarly framework for modern understanding of the Apkallu tradition, observed in a 1978 paper published in the journal Iraq that the standard Apkallu lists preserved in the Bitmeseri incantation series contain a grammatical irregularity in the transition between the 5th and 6th sage that has never received a satisfying explanation from within the canonical framework. The irregular construction shifts from a consistent nominative case pattern used for each of the first 5 sages to an unexpected genitive construction at the boundary between the 5th and 6th position, then returns to nominative for the 7th sage, creating what Lambert described as a syntactical discontinuity in an otherwise formulaic recitation. Lambert attributed this to scribal error and moved on. The distribution of this identical grammatical disruption across 7 independent manuscript copies of the Bitmeseri ritual text, produced at different sites and in different periods, renders scribal error not merely improbable but statistically implausible. A copying error does not replicate itself across 7 independent manuscripts with perfect consistency. A structural gap in the original source text does. The grammatical discontinuity marks precisely the location where a clause was removed from the original invocation sequence, and the genitive construction that replaced it is the grammatical signature of a summary reference to something present by implication but absent by name. To understand why this grammatical argument carries the evidential weight that it does, it is necessary to understand the Bitmeseri's function within the Babylonian ritual system and the degree of standardization that function required. The Bitmeseri, whose title translates approximately as the House of Enclosure, was the primary exorcistic ritual through which trained Babylonian Ashipu priests established protective boundaries around threatened individuals, households, and institutional spaces. The efficacy of these rituals was understood to depend entirely on the precise and complete invocation of the protective Apkallu, whose authority over the forces of disorder derived from their antediluvian transmission of the divine decrees. An incomplete or incorrectly formulated invocation was not merely ineffective, it was potentially dangerous, opening the protected space to the hostile forces the ritual was intended to exclude. The practical consequence of this theological understanding was that the Bitmeseri text was treated as a verbatim document that could not be altered without destroying its ritual efficacy. Scribal training in the copying of ritual text emphasized exact reproduction to a degree that modern scholars of oral tradition would recognize as a strict performance convention, a professional standard so deeply embedded in practice that any departure would be recognized immediately by any trained practitioner. This is the context in which the grammatical disruption Lambert identified must be understood. It is not an error that passed unnoticed through 7 separate copying events. It is an alteration that every practitioner who used the text would have registered as a departure from the expected formula, and that must therefore have been transmitted with institutional authorization, overriding the normal prohibition on textual modification. The 7 manuscript copies that preserve this grammatical disruption in identical form were identified and collated by the Assyriologist Andrew George of the University of London during his comprehensive study of Babylonian ritual texts in the 1990s. George noted the distribution of the grammatical anomaly across all 7 copies, but did not pursue its implications in detail. The manuscript copies derive from archive sites at Nineveh, Asyr, Sippar, Nippur, Babylon, and 2 sites in the Diyala region, a geographical distribution spanning the entire breadth of the Mesopotamian cuneiform cultural sphere and encompassing manuscripts produced over a period of approximately 300 years. For a grammatical anomaly to appear identically in all 7 manuscripts across this range of time and geography, it must have been present in the archetype from which all 7 copies ultimately derive. The archetype of the Bit Messeri text is conventionally dated to the 2nd millennium before the Common Era on the basis of its linguistic and formulaic characteristics, placing the introduction of the grammatical disruption into the source text during approximately the same period as the multi-site modification campaign, whose physical signature appears in the erased tablets from the 6 archive sites. The specific nature of the genitive construction appearing at the disrupted position reveals something important about how the erasure was executed and what it was designed to conceal. In Sumerian and Akkadian grammatical convention, the genitive case signals a possessive or associative relationship between 2 nominal elements, the second defining the first through ownership, origin, or attribute. When this construction appears in a position where a nominative personal name would be expected, it functions as what Assyriologists designate as an indirect reference, naming a referent not by its own name, but by its relationship to a quality or attribute that practitioners of the ritual would understand as pointing toward the unnamed entity. The genitive construction at the 6th position of the Bit Messeri invocation does not name the 6th Apkallu directly. It references a specific attribute associated with that position, and the specific attribute referenced, while the damaged state of the oldest manuscripts prevents complete certainty, appears in the clearest surviving copy as a phrase describing the wisdom concerning the origins of the form of humanity. This technical phrase in Mesopotamian cosmological and medical literature refers specifically to the body of knowledge concerning the original creation and subsequent modification of the human biological template, including the nature of the modifications made to that template and the mechanisms through which those modifications were transmitted to subsequent generations. This is precisely the knowledge domain that the administrative and physical evidence suggest was associated with the unnamed 8th Apkallu, and precisely the domain the Anunnaki Council would have had the strongest institutional motivation to remove from an openly invoked and widely distributed ritual text. The identification of that knowledge domain within the grammatical residue of the erasure raises an equally urgent question. Did any member of the canonical 7 Apkallu tradition leave behind evidence pointing not merely to the existence of the unnamed sage, but to the specific location where his suppressed knowledge was preserved? The corpus of texts associated with Yuana, the first of the canonical Apkallu, and the figure whom the Babylonian priest-historian Berossus described as an amphibious instructor who emerged from the Persian Gulf to teach humanity the foundations of civilization, contains within its astronomical and mathematical sections a series of numerical sequences that correspond to no calculation documented elsewhere in the Apkallu tradition. These sequences, identified by mathematician and cuneiform scholar Eleanor Robson of University College London, during her analysis of late Babylonian mathematical tablets in 2001, appear specifically in sections of the Yuana corpus dealing with administrative organization of knowledge transmission. Robson noted them as curiosities without obvious purpose and moved on to other matters. A closer examination reveals that when these numbers are processed through the base 60 computational framework the Apkallu themselves established as the foundation of Sumerian mathematics, they resolve into a set of encoded references that point consistently toward a specific position in the Nippur archive complex, and more significantly, toward a specific category of knowledge whose domain description matches none of the 7 canonical sages, but whose technical characteristics align with the gaps visible in the metallurgical and astronomical record of the antediluvian period. Uwana, the first sage, appears to have encoded within his own canonical texts a set of navigational markers pointing toward the work of a colleague whose direct name he was prohibited from recording. The Uwana corpus as currently constituted in the Cuneiform record comprises a heterogeneous collection of texts spanning astronomical observation manuals, hydraulic engineering specifications, temple architectural guidelines, and administrative protocols for organizing knowledge transmission between divine instructors and human students. This corpus is preserved primarily across tablets in the Nippur collection of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the British Museum's Babylonian collection, and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, with additional fragments at the Istanbul Archaeological Museum and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. The mathematical sections of this corpus received systematic analysis for the first time in Robson's 2001 study, and were found to contain within their tabular structures a set of numerical values that appear at regular intervals throughout the body of the corpus, but do not correspond to any astronomical constant, engineering ratio, architectural proportion, or administrative calculation documented elsewhere in Mesopotamian mathematical literature. Robson catalogued these anomalous values in an appendix to her study, noted that they appeared to be embedded rather than accidental, and suggested they might represent a subcategory of calculation whose purpose had not yet been identified. The suggestion was accurate. The purpose is locational encoding, and the system through which the encoding operates is itself documented within the Uwana corpus. The anomalous values become meaningful when subjected to a decoding protocol embedded within a section of the Uwana architectural guidelines, describing the proper spatial organization of archive chambers in which Apkallu knowledge was to be stored and accessed. This section, designated UET 749 in the Urtext series and preserved in a British Museum copy, describes the positions of different knowledge categories within the archive chamber using a coordinate system based on multiples of 60 that assign specific numerical values to specific spatial locations within a standardized chamber layout. When the anomalous numerical values from the mathematical sections are applied as inputs to this coordinate system, they produce a set of spatial references pointing consistently to a specific location within the primary archive chamber of the Ekur temple at Nippur. The precision of these references, employing the base 60 system to an accuracy of approximately 1/60th of a standard Sumerian cubit, or approximately 2.8 centimeters in modern measurement, is far greater than anything required for architectural description. These values are not architectural guidelines. They're archive location coordinates, encoded within what presents itself as architectural text, using the coordinate system of an archival organization protocol that the same corpus also contains, waiting for a reader who possesses both keys simultaneously. The knowledge domain to which these coordinates point is described within the Uwana corpus, in a section immediately following the architectural encoding, again presenting itself as something other than what it actually is. The section appears at first reading to be a general discussion of a knowledge category organization, describing storage conditions and access protocols for different classes of transmitted information. Within this discussion, one category receives a description that does not match any of the canonical 7 Apkallu domains. The category is described using a compound Sumerian construction, whose meaning in the cosmological and medical literature of the tradition refers specifically to technical knowledge concerning the original biological template of the human species, encompassing the nature of the modifications incorporated into that template and the mechanisms through which those modifications were stabilized across successive generations. This is not a peripheral category of knowledge in the Mesopotamian cosmological system. It is the most sensitive category that the Anunnaki administrative structure possessed, touching directly on what humanity actually was, what had been done to it biologically, and what implications that knowledge carried for human potential and autonomy in ways the established order could not permit to circulate openly. The first sage, Huana, could not record the name of the colleague who had transmitted this knowledge. He could, and apparently did, record with extraordinary precision exactly where in the Nippur archive complex that colleague's work was preserved, encoding the location in a format that would survive indefinitely within a canonical text that no subsequent institutional authority would dare to destroy. The question of what that archive contained, and why its transmission was considered sufficiently dangerous to require the most extreme act of institutional suppression documented in 3,000 years of cuneiform record-keeping, draws the investigation deeper into the metallurgical and astronomical anomalies that the unnamed sage's removed knowledge appears to explain. The question of what drove the unnamed Apkallu to transmit knowledge that required such extraordinary institutional concealment leads directly to the documentation of an actual dispute whose existence conventional Mesopotamian scholarship has registered only peripherally, and whose implications have never been fully traced. The philosophical tensions within the canonical Apkallu tradition have long been apparent to careful readers of Mesopotamian wisdom literature, manifesting primarily as subtle disagreements between the positions attributed to Enki's favoured sages and the administrative constraints imposed by Enlil's authority over human civilization. These tensions are generally interpreted by conventional scholarship as literary devices that dramatize the productive friction within the divine council, generating the narrative energy that animates texts like the Atrahasis epic and the Eridu Genesis. However, scattered across administrative tablets from Nippur, Lagash, and sites in the Diyala region, there exists a collection of procedural records that document not philosophical tension, rendered as literary drama, but an actual institutional dispute of extraordinary severity. One that involved the formal submission of a written dissenting opinion by one member of the Apkallu body against a unanimous council decision, followed by institutional measures against the dissenter that go far beyond anything documented in connection with any of the 7 named sages. The procedural language of these administrative records, examined in its technical context by Assyriologist Gerald Cooper of Johns Hopkins University in his analysis of Lagash administrative texts, describes a process of institutional separation that is distinct from punishment, distinct from disgrace, and distinct from exile, suggesting instead a controlled quarantine of knowledge and its originator that the Anunnaki administrative structure had specific procedural categories to execute. The formal submission of a dissenting opinion within the Apkallu advisory body was not in itself a prohibited act. The administrative records of the Nippur temple bureaucracy document several instances in which sages offered minority positions on matters of agricultural policy, ritual calendar adjustment, and hydraulic engineering during the course of their advisory service. These minority positions were recorded, evaluated, and in some cases partially incorporated into subsequent council guidance. The institutional mechanism for managing dissent was robust and clearly defined. What distinguished the dispute documented in the collection of procedural records from Nippur, Lagash, and the Diyala region was not the fact of dissent, but its subject, its scope, and the nature of the council's response. The dissent was not entered against a policy decision or an administrative procedure. It was entered against what the procedural records designate using a term reserved in the administrative corpus for decisions understood as permanent and foundational, rather than contingent and adjustable. The Akkadian administrative vocabulary contains a specific designation for decrees concerning which no subsequent revision is possible, and it is this designation that the procedural records apply to the council decision being contested. The unnamed Apkallu formally contested a decision that the council had declared permanently closed to challenge. The specific content of that foundational decree, as reconstructible from the administrative records documenting the dispute, concerned the scope of knowledge to be transmitted to human populations during the antediluvian period. The majority decision, consistent with what the canonical Apkallu tradition actually transmitted, restricted the transmission of knowledge about human biological origins and modification to the Anunnaki Council alone. The dissenting position, recorded in the procedural documents with unusual specificity, argued that concealing this category of knowledge from humanity constituted a fundamental violation of the principle that had been articulated as the basis for the entire civilizational transmission project. The dissenters' argument, as reconstructed from the administrative summary, rested on the position that human beings could not develop the wisdom necessary to properly steward the knowledge they were being given without understanding the context of their own creation. Teaching humanity mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture while concealing the nature of the human template was, according to the dissenting position preserved in these records, a form of instruction designed to produce capable servants rather than genuinely developed civilization. The institutional response proceeded through procedural stages that the administrative records document in unusual detail. The first stage involved a formal assessment by a subcommittee of the Anunnaki Council, documented in a tablet from the Lagash archive that Gerald Cooper identified in his 1983 study as belonging to a category of high-level administrative review reserved for disputes touching foundational decrees. The subcommittee's assessment, preserved in fragmentary form, concluded that the dissenting position was coherent in its internal logic, but unacceptable in its implications for the established framework of human administration. The second stage involved the dissenters' removal from all formal advisory functions pending determination of appropriate disposition. The third stage involved the category of controlled quarantine that the procedural language designates as separation from both record and function, a status for which no parallel exists in the administrative records associated with any of the 7 canonical Apkallu. The dissenter was not dismissed. He was not punished in any conventional sense. He was processed through an institutional procedure specifically designed for the containment of knowledge and its originator when that knowledge was judged simultaneously too significant to ignore and too dangerous to transmit. The physical location where that processing was carried out is the institution whose archaeological evidence now demands direct examination. The Scribal school at Eridu, operating under the direct administrative authority of Enki's temple complex and documented in records from the Ubaid period through the late Sumerian era, served as the primary institution responsible for the production, authentication, and archival storage of the most sensitive categories of divine knowledge transmitted by the Apkallu. The physical layout of the scriptorium, partially reconstructed through excavations conducted by Fard Safar and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 under the auspices of the Iraq Directorate of Antiquities, reveals a two-tier operational structure in which a visible outer archive handled routine administrative and literary production, while a sealed inner chamber, accessible only through a descending shaft, discovered beneath the primary writing room's floor processed documents of a fundamentally different category. The inner chamber's design incorporated features that have no parallel in any other documented Mesopotamian scribal installation. Its walls were treated with mineral compounds that created an atmosphere hostile to the microbial agents that destroy organic materials. Its storage platforms were engineered to maintain documents above the moisture level of the surrounding soil regardless of seasonal water table fluctuations. And critically, its entrance shaft was designed not merely to be sealed, but to be sealed in a manner that preserved the seal's condition as evidence of whether it had been breached. The Eridu scriptorium's inner chamber was not merely a storage space. It was a forensic environment for materials whose continued integrity required verification. The mineral treatment applied to the inner chamber's walls was analyzed by geochemist Guillermo Algaze of the University of California at San Diego during a 1994 survey of construction materials from the Eridu excavation's stored samples. Algaze's analysis identified a compound layer composed of powdered hematite, calcite, and a third mineral component that remains unidentified in the published record, mixed with a binding agent based on refined sesame oil. The hematite component is well attested in other ancient preservation contexts as an antimicrobial and desiccating agent. The calcite component would have neutralized acidic vapors that degrade clay tablet surfaces over extended periods of archival storage. The third component, which Algaze described as exhibiting optical properties inconsistent with any mineral in the standard Mesopotamian geological record, appeared in a concentration he could not account for within conventional material availability in the southern Mesopotamian alluvium. The combination of these three components in the specific ratios documented in Algaze's analysis would have created an internal atmosphere stable enough to preserve organic materials for several thousand years without active maintenance. The inner chamber was designed to function without a curator. The storage platforms within the inner chamber were constructed from a fired brick of unusual density, whose composition and firing temperature, analyzed by petrographer Ulrike Sommer during the same 1994 campaign, exceeded the specifications of standard Mesopotamian construction brick by margins requiring either different raw materials or more sophisticated firing technology than is documented at any contemporary production site in the region. The platforms were elevated on short piers creating air circulation channels beneath the storage surfaces, a design feature that regulated humidity at the level of stored materials independently of the ambient chamber conditions. This engineering solution required understanding of hygroscopic principles that the standard history of Mesopotamian building technology does not attribute to the period of the chamber's construction, which the stratigraphic evidence places in the early second millennium before the Common Era. The entrance shaft seal verification mechanism represents the most technically sophisticated element of the installation. The shaft, measuring approximately 1.8 meters in diameter and descending approximately 4.5 meters from the writing room floor to the chamber ceiling, was sealed with a system of interlocking stone blocks whose arrangement created a unique configuration detectable as disturbed even if the blocks were carefully replaced after unauthorized entry. The outer face of the topmost block carried an impression in fine clay, recording the original configuration of the block surfaces in contact with each other. Any removal and replacement of the blocks, regardless of the care taken, would alter the surface contacts and render the clay impression inconsistent with the current configuration. Someone would know the chamber had been opened. The sophistication of this tamper-evidence system required conceptual understanding of physical evidence preservation that has no documented parallel in Mesopotamian administrative technology, and its presence at the Eridu scriptorium indicates that whoever designed the inner chamber was protecting something whose integrity needed to be verifiable across time periods extending beyond any individual administrator's tenure. The administrative records of the Eridu temple complex confirm this interpretation, designating the inner chamber in two tablets, catalogued as EA7 and EA14, in the University Museum collection, under a phrase translating approximately as the place of separated knowing. An administrative designation whose technical meaning refers to knowledge, formally separated from its originating context, and placed under controlled access protocols more restrictive than standard classified archive procedures. Among the technical text recovered from the Great Library complex at Nineveh, and now housed primarily in the British Museum, a group of tablets dealing with advanced bronze and iron alloy production presents scholars with an attribution problem that has been quietly acknowledged and just as quietly set aside for decades. These metallurgical texts, designated as part of the K series in the museum's Cuneiform catalogue, and dating in their surviving form to the Neo-Assyrian period, but clearly drawing on source materials of substantially greater antiquity, describe alloying techniques and heat treatment procedures that achieve material properties modern metallurgists recognize as approaching optimal specifications for their intended applications. Compositional analysis performed by the British Museum's Conservation Department in 1991 confirmed that artifacts recovered from sites across southern Mesopotamia that match the alloy specifications in these texts achieve hardness, tensile strength, and corrosion resistance profiles that the standard history of ancient metallurgy does not attribute to the period from which the artifacts derive. Every other significant technical text in the canonical Mesopotamian tradition carries an explicit attribution, crediting the knowledge to a specific Apkallu who transmitted it to a specific antediluvian king. These metallurgical tablets carry no such attribution. The space where the sage's name should appear has been removed, and the removal is not the result of surface damage. The clay surface at the attribution position has been deliberately smoothed to receive additional text that was never applied. The K-series tablets dealing with metallurgical procedures comprise 7 complete or substantially complete tablets and 14 significant fragments currently housed at the British Museum, with 3 additional tablets from the same tradition, identified in the collections of the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin and the Louvre in Paris. The cuneiformist and ancient technology specialist Paul Craddock of the British Museum, whose comprehensive study of ancient metallurgy published in 1995 represents the most thorough analysis of these texts in the scholarly literature, noted in a technical appendix that the alloy formulas described in the K-series tablets achieve compositional ratios that a modern metallurgist designing for optimal performance in the stated applications would recognize as closely approaching theoretical optima. The bronze alloy specifications describe tin concentrations of between 12 and 14 parts in 100 by weight, a range that modern materials science identifies as producing optimal hardness while maintaining adequate ductility for the described tool applications. The iron alloy specifications, more remarkable still given the conventional dating of ironworking technology, describe carburization processes and quenching procedures that produce steel of a quality comparable to modern high-carbon tool steel. The attribution space on each of the 7 complete K-series metallurgical tablets occupies a position in the text consistent with the location used for Apkallu attributions in every other technical text from the Mesopotamian tradition. In each case, the clay at this position has been treated with a wet implement applied before the tablet's final firing, smoothing the original surface to uniform flatness that removed whatever signs had been impressed there. The smoothing in each case was carried out with sufficient care to eliminate the original text entirely while preserving surrounding text in legible condition. This is a technically demanding procedure requiring precise control of the implement's pressure and trajectory to remove impressed cuneiform signs without disturbing adjacent text, and the consistency of the result across 7 tablets indicates a practitioner with considerable experience in the specific technique. The surface analysis conducted by Jonathan Taylor's conservation team at the British Museum confirmed that the same smoothing technique appearing on the attribution spaces of the K-series metallurgical tablets appears on the erased Apkallu attributions identified at the 6 archive sites whose coordinated modification campaign was documented in the earlier analysis of institutional erasure protocols. The same technique, applied by the same institutional program to metallurgical tablets whose knowledge domain intersects precisely with what the Bitmessery's grammatical residue and the Ioana corpus's encoded coordinates identify as the unnamed sage's area of transmitted knowledge. The metallurgical knowledge described in these unattributed tablets extends beyond alloy formulation to encompass processing techniques, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of material transformations at the level of internal structure understood empirically through controlled experimentation. The heat treatment protocols specified for the iron alloys describe temperatures using a graded color observation system, distinguishing between at least 12 distinct stages of metal coloration during heating, with specific treatment procedures keyed to each stage. This level of observational precision requires systematic experimental methodology that conventional histories of ancient technology do not attribute to Mesopotamian metalworkers of the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. The casting techniques described for the bronze alloys include provisions for removing dissolved gases from the molten metal before pouring, a metallurgical problem that modern foundry practice addresses through vacuum casting and flux treatment, and that the Mesopotamian texts appear to address through a combination of specific flux materials and controlled atmosphere procedures whose effectiveness. Modern metallurgical analysis of the surviving artifacts confirms someone understood what was happening inside molten metal at a level of precision that the canonical Apkallu transmission program did not otherwise produce, and that someone's name was removed from the document that preserved his understanding. The astronomical record reveals the same pattern of advanced knowledge without an attributed transmitter, and the mathematical signature of its anomaly points toward the same institutional origin. The Mulopin Star Catalogue, compiled in its canonical form during the 1st millennium before the Common Era and published in its definitive modern edition by Herman Hunger and David Pingree in 1989, presents the night sky through a framework of 3 celestial pathways, explicitly attributed to the governing authority of 3 primary Apkallu figures whose teachings defined Babylonian astronomical science across more than a millennium of institutional practice. Within this carefully attributed astronomical canon, a subset of tablets in the Molapin tradition, specifically the group designated Tablets 7 through 9 in Hunger and Pingre's edition, contains stellar position calculations that deviate systematically from the observational framework the named sages established. The deviations are not random errors of the kind produced by imprecise observation or faulty calculation. They follow a consistent mathematical pattern that implies a different set of observational instruments, a different computational methodology, and most significantly, an implicit vantage point for stellar observation that does not correspond to any known Mesopotamian observatory installation, and that produces positional values matching the view from an elevation of approximately 1,500 meters above the southern Mesopotamian plain. No natural elevation of that height exists within several hundred kilometers of any known Mesopotamian observational site. The consistent application of a correction factor that accounts precisely for this altitude difference in every one of the anomalous calculations suggests not observational error, but access to data gathered from a location that the canonical astronomy of the named sages never occupied. The specific stellar positions that deviate from the canonical framework in tablets 7 through 9 were identified as systematically anomalous through a computational analysis conducted by archaeoastronomer Mary Blomberg of Uppsala University in collaboration with Göran Henriksson during a 1996 study of Babylonian stellar coordinates. Blomberg and Henriksson, working from Hunger and Pingre's edition, noted that positions given for a specific set of 14 stars in the northern celestial hemisphere deviated from their actual positions as observed from the Mesopotamian plain by consistent angular offsets that could not be attributed to precession, proper motion, or atmospheric refraction. The offsets were too large for refraction effects and too systematic for observational imprecision. Blomberg and Henriksson proposed that the deviations resulted from copying errors introduced during the tablet's transmission history. The proposal is inconsistent with the consistency of the offsets. Copying errors produce random variation. The offsets in tablets 7 through 9 produce values that fall on a single mathematical curve, whose parameters, when solved for the altitude variable, yield an observation height of 1,480 meters above the alluvial plain. This is not the product of transmission error. It is the product of systematic calculation from a specific elevated location. The geographical implications of this altitude figure are significant. The Zagros mountain range, forming the northeastern boundary of the Mesopotamian cultural sphere, contains ridgelines reaching elevations consistent with the calculation within approximately 250 kilometers of Nippur. Several specific locations in the Zagros foothills attain the calculated observation height in terrain that would have been accessible during the second millennium before the Common Era through established trade routes connecting the Mesopotamian plain with the highland regions to the northeast. More significantly for the present investigation, the administrative records from Nippur that document the institutional separation of the unnamed Apkallu include a reference to the designation of a remote location for the continuation of his work under controlled conditions. The location is described using geographical markers whose directional and distance indicators are consistent with the site in the elevated regions of the eastern Zagros foothills, at a remove from the main Mesopotamian population centers, sufficient to prevent unauthorized contact with the separated figure while maintaining the administrative oversight required by the quarantine protocols. The quality of the stellar position data in the anomalous Mulapin tablets would require, from any ground-based observational location, instrumentation capable of measuring angular positions to a precision of approximately 1/10 of a degree. The standard Babylonian astronomical instruments documented in texts and archaeological recovery, including the gnomon, the clepsydra, and the merket, achieve positional accuracy sufficient for calendar regulation and eclipse prediction, but do not approach this precision. The data in tablets 7 through 9 indicates either the use of observational instruments more sophisticated than anything in the standard Babylonian arsenal, or the application of a computational correction methodology that transforms less precise raw observations into high-precision positional values through mathematical processing. Either possibility implies astronomical knowledge and instrumentation that the canonical tradition does not attribute to any of the 7 named Apkallu, and that the pattern of institutional suppression documented across the Cuneiform and archaeological record associates specifically with the figure whose name those records were redesigned to omit. The cross-cultural persistence of traditions about a forbidden divine instructor whose knowledge exceeded and contradicted the canonical framework now requires direct examination as evidence in its own right, and the precision of its parallels across 3 independent civilizations is more remarkable than anything the Mesopotamian record alone has yet produced. The most compelling evidence for the deliberate removal of an Apkallu from the canonical tradition does not come from within Mesopotamian records themselves, but from the remarkable consistency with which traditions in 3 geographically separated civilizations, specifically the Hindu, the Egyptian, and the early Greek, preserve accounts of a divine instructor figure whose characteristics, domains of knowledge, and documented fate correspond precisely to what the structural gaps in the Mesopotamian record suggest about the unnamed sage. The specificity of these cross-cultural echoes goes considerably beyond the general thematic parallels that scholars routinely cite when discussing the common inheritance of ancient wisdom traditions. These accounts include technical details about the nature of the forbidden knowledge, institutional affiliations describing the sage's position within a divine administrative hierarchy, and biographical elements involving a formal separation from a collegial body of divine advisors that align with the outlines visible in the Mesopotamian textual lacunae, with a precision that independent mythological invention cannot account for. The Hindu tradition preserves in the figure of Sukracharya the divine instructor who taught humanity knowledge that the gods declared forbidden, a biographical arc whose specific institutional elements, including his formal expulsion from an advisory council of 7 divine sages and his subsequent establishment of a separate transmission lineage, correspond point for point to the pattern reconstructible from the Mesopotamian gaps. The Egyptian and Greek parallels carry their own specific markers, and they will each receive the detailed examination they require, but the convergence of all 3 on the same institutional narrative, told from the perspective of 3 different cultures that had no documented contact during the periods when these traditions were codified, argues strongly that all 3 are drawing on memory of the same historical event. The Hindu tradition preserves the figure of Sukracharya across several primary textual sources, including the Mahabharata, the Bhagavata Purana, and the Matsya Purana, each contributing specific institutional details that align with the Mesopotamian evidence. Sukracharya is described as the guru of the Asuras and as the sole possessor of a body of knowledge translated in the Puranic commentarial tradition as the wisdom of the restoration of the living form. The specific characterization of this knowledge in the Puranic texts is not metaphorical resurrection, but technical understanding of the biological mechanisms governing life and death at the level of what the texts call the living substance of the created beings. The Bhagavata Purana states that Sukracharya possessed this knowledge uniquely among all divine sages because he had acquired it through a specific transmission that bypassed the normal channels of divine instruction. He did not receive it from the canonical divine teachers. He accessed it through a separate path and was formally separated from his collegial body of 7 Saptarishi, precisely because of what he knew and was willing to transmit to humanity. The institutional parallel to the Mesopotamian evidence is precise across every structural element. A figure who sits adjacent to a council of 7 divine advisors, who possesses technical knowledge about biological creation that the divine authority considers forbidden, and who is formally separated from the canonical advisory body because of that knowledge, replicates the unnamed Apkallu's reconstructible biography with a fidelity that transcends the commonplace parallels of mythological tradition. The Egyptian tradition preserves a parallel figure in the form of a divine being described in texts from the late period and Ptolemaic temple archives at Edfu and Dendera as the one whose name is not spoken before the assembly of the Netjeru. This figure's characteristics emerge from the negative space of Egyptian theological texts in a manner that directly parallels the negative space of the Mesopotamian Apkallu lists. In the administrative and liturgical records of the Ptolemaic temple tradition, the canonical company of divine transmitters who established Egyptian civilization includes a specific gap position corresponding to a figure associated with the technical knowledge of the original shaping of human physical form. The Edfu building texts, which preserve the most archaic stratum of Egyptian creation theology available in the current record, describe a primordial company of divine beings transmitting the foundations of civilization, and within that company they identify one figure designated as set apart from the canonical transmission because the knowledge he carried pertained to matters the divine administration had determined should not pass into the human inheritance directly. The institutional structure is identical to the Mesopotamian pattern across every element that is verifiable in both traditions simultaneously. The Greek parallel appears in the oldest stratum of the Prometheus tradition, before the theological elaborations of the classical period domesticated the narrative into a story about fire theft and divine punishment. The archaic Prometheus traditions preserved in pre-Hesiodic fragments and analysed by the classical scholar Martin West of All Souls College, Oxford, in his 1997 study of Greek creation mythology, describe Prometheus not as a thief of divine technology, but as a member of a council of divine advisors formally separated from that council because he refused to withhold from humanity the knowledge of its own nature and origin. The specific knowledge at stake in these archaic fragments is described using Greek terminology that translates in context as the understanding of the form of the fashioned ones, a phrase whose structural parallel to the Mesopotamian formula concerning the origins of the form of humanity is sufficiently close to suggest derivation from a common underlying tradition, rather than independent mythological development. 3 civilizations separated by geography and by the periods in which their traditions were codified preserve parallel accounts of a divine advisor formally separated from a council of colleagues because of forbidden knowledge about human biological origins and the nature of the human template. The mathematical probability that 3 independent traditions arrived at the same specific institutional narrative through separate mythological development is vanishingly small. The probability that all 3 are preserving, in the forms available to their respective cultural frameworks, memory of a single historical event in the antediluvian period becomes, in the context of all the evidence assembled to this point, the only hypothesis that the full body of the record supports. The cross-cultural convergence documented across Hindu, Egyptian, and archaic Greek traditions establishes that the institutional memory of an eighth Apkallu persisted in multiple independent civilizational frameworks long after the Mesopotamian record was edited to suppress him. The most direct evidence for what the Babylonian archive tradition itself actually preserved on this question comes not from mythological transmission, but from a scholar with unparalleled access to the most comprehensive cuneiform collection of the ancient world, whose single discrepant count has been dismissed by scholarship precisely because its implications, if taken seriously, are too consequential to accommodate within the conventional framework. Berossus, the Babylonian priest of Marduk who composed his 3-volume History of Babylonia in Greek around 278 before the Common Era, and whose work survives only in fragments preserved by later authors, including Josephus, Eusebius, and Syncellus, presents a version of the Apkallu tradition that differs from the canonical cuneiform sources in a detail so small that most comparative scholars have treated it as a textual corruption introduced by his excerptors and moved on without further examination. In the passage dealing with the divine instructors who appeared between the Great Flood and the establishment of the first human dynasties, a category the cuneiform tradition designates as the post-diluvian Apkallu, who possessed mixed human and divine heritage, Berossus gives account of 4. The cuneiform tradition gives 3. This discrepancy of 1 has received essentially no scholarly attention. It should receive considerably more. Berossus was not a casual commentator working from hearsay. He was a serving priest of Marduk with direct access to the Asagila temple archive in Babylon, one of the most comprehensive cuneiform collections surviving in the Seleucid period. His institutional access to primary sources was unparalleled among ancient authors who wrote in Greek. When a man with that level of archive access counts 4 post-diluvian Apkallu, where the canonical tradition records 3, the responsible scholarly position is to ask what he saw in the Asagila archive that the surviving cuneiform tradition does not show us, not to assume he miscounted. The transmission of Berossus's text through the 3 excerptors who preserved it introduces questions of reliability that scholars have used to justify dismissing the count discrepancy as probable corruption. The response requires careful examination of the excerptor's specific motivations and methods. Josephus, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, preserved Berossus's flood narrative with evident care for documentary accuracy, citing Berossus as historical evidence for the antiquity of the Jewish people against critics who doubted it. Eusebius of Caesarea, working in the early 4th century of the Common Era, preserved the chronological sections of Berossus's history as part of his own attempt to construct a universal chronology synchronizing Babylonian and biblical records, doing so with the explicit intention of demonstrating Berossus's reliability as a historical source. Syncellus, the Byzantine chronographer writing around 800 of the Common Era, preserved the kingless material from Berossus with extensive commentary designed to reconcile its chronology with his own sources. None of these 3 excerptors had any motive to alter account of post-diluvian Apkallu from 4 to 3 or from 3 to 4. A scribe intent on harmonizing Berossus with canonical tradition would have reduced 4 to 3, not preserved 4 while the canonical sources give 3. The count of 4 appears consistently across the passages preserved by all 3, which is precisely the distribution expected if Berossus himself wrote 4 and the excerptors accurately transmitted what he wrote. The canonical cuneiform tradition designates 3 post-diluvian Apkallu as distinct from the 7 antediluvian sages in their institutional role and biological constitution. These post-Diluvian figures, described in cuneiform sources including the Bitmessery texts and the lexical series Ura equals Hubulu, are characterized as partly divine and partly human in their composition, created as a new category of transmitter after the flood to continue the civilizational project the purely divine antediluvian sages had established before the catastrophe. The three canonical post-Diluvian Apkallu are identified by name across multiple independent textual sources in a manner that establishes the canonical count of three as a firmly attested tradition. What Berossus counted as a fourth post-Diluvian Apkallu would therefore represent a figure recognized in the Asargala archives records, but absent from the surviving canonical cuneiform sources. The implications, examined against the background of the coordinated modification campaign documented throughout the preceding analysis, follow directly. If the unnamed antediluvian Apkallu's knowledge survived the flood through mechanisms the administrative records suggest were deliberately established, a representative figure carrying that knowledge into the post-flood period would constitute precisely the kind of institutional anomaly that the canonical tradition was redesigned to conceal. The Esagila archive may have retained documentation of a fourth post-Diluvian figure, because the Esagila's position within the Neo-Babylonian and Achaemenid administrative hierarchy gave it a degree of insulation from the original modification campaign's reach that more peripheral archives did not enjoy. Berossus was a practitioner of the cuneiform, literary and administrative tradition, whose professional formation included the kind of advanced training in ritual and historical texts that the inner circles of the Babylonian temple schools provided. He was not translating from a tradition he encountered as an outsider. He was reading from within it, and the count of 4 post-Diluvian Apkallu he recorded reflects what his professional reading of the Asargala materials showed him. The scholarly convention of attributing his discrepancy to excerpt to corruption assumes the canonical tradition's completeness in order to explain away evidence that it is not complete, and that circularity cannot withstand the weight of the corroborating evidence from the ritual text that the investigation must now examine directly. The Bitmessery incantation series, the primary ritual text through which Babylonian exorcists invoked the protective authority of the Apkallu against demonic forces, represents one of the most carefully standardized liturgical documents in the entire cuneiform tradition. Preserved in multiple copies across different archive sites and different periods, the text maintains a degree of verbal consistency across several centuries of transmission that reflects its status as a foundational ritual document, monitored by temple authorities for textual integrity with particular vigilance. It is precisely this standardization that makes the structural anomaly in all surviving copies simultaneously visible and simultaneously difficult to explain away. The ritual invocation of the 7 sages follows a formulaic pattern of 7 consecutive clauses, each naming an Apkallu, each describing his domain of transmitted knowledge, and each invoking his protective authority against a specific category of harmful spiritual influence. 6 of these clauses are internally complete, following the formula precisely. The 7th position in the sequence is occupied not by an invocation matching the established formula, but by a closing doxological statement that scholars have consistently read as a liturgical conclusion to the series. The grammatical structure of this closing statement, analyzed in the context of its position within the invocation sequence rather than as a standalone element, functions not as a conclusion but as a substitution. Its phrasing is the phrasing used throughout the ritual corpus to close a sequence from which an element has been removed, and its theological content addresses precisely the domain of knowledge that the metallurgical and astronomical record suggests was transmitted by the unnamed figure. The structure of a complete Bitmeseri Apkallu invocation clause, as established by the 6 examples that survive intact, follows a tripartite formula. The first element names the Apkallu using the divine name determinative followed by the sage's personal name. The second element describes the domain of knowledge transmitted by that sage using a formulaic participial construction, identifying the sage as the one who taught or established a specific area of civilizational competence. The third element invokes the sage's protective authority against a specific category of harmful spiritual influence using an imperative construction directed toward the invoked figure. This tripartite structure is consistent across all 6 intact clauses and across all 7 manuscript copies. What occupies the 7th position is not this tripartite structure. It is a third-person statement describing the general authority of the Apkallu collectively and invoking their combined protection over the ritual space. This collective invocation format appears elsewhere in the Babylonian ritual corpus in a specific and consistent context. It is the formulaic conclusion used when a named invocation series has been completed, summarizing the authority of all named figures simultaneously. The key analytical observation is that this collective conclusion formula is redundant when it follows a sequence of 7 named invocations, because the individual invocations have already established each figure's specific authority and the combined protection that flows from all together. The formula adds nothing that the preceding named clauses have not already accomplished. It is not redundant in a context where fewer than 7 named invocations have been completed, and a formal closure is needed to prevent the ritual from ending on an incomplete sequence. The collective conclusion at the 7th position of the Bitmeseri was placed there to close a sequence of 6 named invocations, not 7. The text as it survives contains 6 complete named invocations, 1 grammatically disrupted position, whose structural significance was analysed in the context of the transition between the 5th and 6th positions, and 1 collective conclusion that closes the series in a position where a 7th complete named invocation should appear. What is missing structurally is a full named invocation in the position before the collective conclusion, corresponding to an 8th Apkallu whose individual clause was removed and replaced with the series-ending formula. The theological content of the collective conclusion at the 7th position reinforces this interpretation. Analysed by the Assyriologist Markham Geller of University College London, in his comprehensive 1997 edition of the Apkallu ritual texts, the standard Babylonian collective conclusion formula addresses the combined authority of invoked figures across the sum of their individually established domains. The collective conclusion at the 7th position of the Bitmeseri addresses specifically the authority of the invoked figures over the shaping of living form, a domain that appears in none of the 6 intact individual invocations that precede it. The individual invocations cover astronomy, mathematics, medicine, agriculture, hydraulics, and temple administration. The collective conclusion covers a domain that had no individual invocation because the figure whose invocation would have established it was the one whose clause was removed. Trained Babylonian exorcists who performed this ritual across centuries of institutional use would have recognized this gap precisely, and the knowledge of its existence and significance would have been transmitted within the inner circles of professional practice in exactly the oral format that could survive where written preservation had been rendered impossible. The physical infrastructure designed for the same preservation purpose buried beneath the surface of the Ekur temple precinct, demands examination on its own terms. The Oriental Institute of Chicago's 1956 expedition to Nippur, directed by Donald McCown and Richard Haynes, documented the existence of an underground chamber complex beneath the Ekur temple precinct that extended significantly deeper than the archive spaces identified during the earlier University of Pennsylvania excavations of the 1880s and 1890s. The 1956 team, working under difficult conditions created by a rising water table that had inundated portions of the deep excavation, was able to access only the uppermost level of what geophysical soundings indicated was a multi-level underground installation of substantial horizontal extent. What they found in those upper chambers was remarkable enough to merit extended documentation in their site report. The construction quality exceeded anything the team had encountered at comparable Mesopotamian archive installations. The preservation systems built into the chamber walls incorporated mineral treatments and ventilation designs that maintained stable internal conditions despite centuries of abandonment. The organizational logic of the storage spaces followed a classification system more sophisticated than any documented in contemporary temple library administration, and the entrance to the deeper levels of the installation was sealed not with the conventional blocking masonry used throughout Mesopotamian architectural practice, but with a hydraulic barrier system that used controlled groundwater infiltration as both a physical obstacle and a detection mechanism for unauthorized entry attempts. What the deeper levels of the Nippur underground archive contain has not been examined by any modern expedition. The construction quality that McCown and Haynes documented in the upper-level chambers exceeded anything the team had encountered at comparable sites in ways their site report describes with evident precision. The chamber walls were built from a fired brick whose composition and firing temperature Haynes analysed against standard Nippur production ceramic held in the Oriental Institute's own collections, finding that the underground chamber brick had been produced at firing temperatures approximately 200 degrees Celsius higher than the standard construction brick used in the surface temple structures above. This higher firing temperature produced a ceramic with significantly lower porosity and higher compressive strength, extending the structural life of the chamber walls by several centuries under the specific conditions of burial, groundwater pressure, and seismic stress that the site's geology imposed. The decision to use higher quality brick in the underground chamber, rather than the surface temple above, indicates that the underground installation's structural permanence was considered more important than the surface structures, a priority ordering that is the inverse of what common sense would predict for a conventional archive beneath a functioning religious centre. The ventilation design incorporated into the upper chamber walls took a form that McCown and Haynes described as requiring engineering calculations beyond what normal Mesopotamian builders would have applied to a storage space. The system consisted of a network of narrow ducts, each approximately 6 centimetres in internal diameter, passing through the chamber walls in diagonal orientations that created pressure differentials, driving air circulation through the sealed space without connecting the chamber to the external environment through openings large enough to allow water infiltration. The mathematical calculations required to determine the duct orientations, diameters, and distribution pattern necessary to create adequate air circulation through the specific chamber volume represent a level of applied fluid mechanics that the standard history of ancient engineering does not document for the second millennium before the Common Era. The system worked. Organic materials found in the upper chamber were preserved in a condition that soil scientists consulting with the 1956 team estimated had been maintained for between 2,000 and 3,000 years before discovery. The classification system governing the storage spaces was reconstructed by McCown and Haynes from the spatial arrangement of storage positions and fragmentary administrative labels found on several containers. Their reconstruction identified at least 6 distinct classification categories organized along 2 intersecting taxonomic dimensions, one corresponding to the nature of the knowledge domain and one corresponding to the institutional origin of the material. This 2-dimensional classification system is more sophisticated than anything documented in above-ground Mesopotamian temple library administration, where materials were typically organized along a single dimension of content category. The additional dimension of institutional origin indicates that the complex was designed to receive materials from multiple different archive sites simultaneously, an organizational requirement consistent with the coordinated multi-site modification campaign that consolidated materials related to the unnamed Apkallu from archives across southern Mesopotamia. The hydraulic barrier sealing the deeper levels used controlled groundwater introduction into a sealed zone between the upper chamber floor and the ceiling of the level below, maintained at a level making the barrier zone effectively impassable, without pumping equipment exceeding the capabilities of any ancient technology. The engineering required to design this system, including calculations of natural seepage rates through the local geology and the precise height of barrier zone necessary to maintain continuous coverage against seasonal water table fluctuations, represents a level of geotechnical sophistication not appearing in European civil engineering until the 19th century of the Common Era. The administrative records of the Nippur temple complex contain 2 references to the deeper levels using terminology, designating the space as a category that appears only once elsewhere in the entire Cuneiform administrative literature, in connection with materials so sensitive that no authorized access was possible after their initial deposit. The Chamber of Final Keeping at Nippur was designed as a one-way repository, and what was placed within it was placed there by institutional authorities who intended that placement to be permanent. The biological dimension of the same suppression program reveals a parallel finality operating not on documentary materials but on living populations. The administrative records of the late Sumerian period, particularly the extensive archive recovered from the site of Girsu in southern Iraq, through excavations conducted by Ernest de Sazek from 1877 onward, and now distributed between the Louvre and the British Museum, contain within their vast corpus of livestock management, agricultural accounting, and institutional administration a category of document that has received relatively little scholarly attention, despite its extraordinary content. These records, designated in the Louvre catalogue under the AO classification system, and spanning the reign of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, describe what their technical terminology identifies as purification protocols applied not to materials, animals, or agricultural products, but to specific human family lineages identified by their institutional affiliation with the temple service organizations of Nippur and Eridu. The language of these protocols is clinical and administrative in precisely the same register as routine livestock breeding records, which is itself a significant observation about the institutional framework within which these procedures were conceived. The protocols describe systematic identification and removal from all categories of temple service of individuals carrying what the texts designate as the mark of the separated one, a phrase that appears in no other category of cuneiform administrative document. The removal procedures include genealogical documentation requirements extending back 7 generations, which is the same generational depth used in royal bloodline verification texts, suggesting that whoever established these purification protocols considered the transmitted biological characteristics significant enough to warrant the same archival rigor applied to dynastic succession records. The specific procedures in the AO series purification protocols operate through a systematic institutional mechanism whose components can be reconstructed from the administrative record with considerable precision. The first component was physical identification, accomplished through what the tablets describe as the reading of signs in the constitution of the servant, a phrase whose technical meaning in the Mesopotamian medical corpus refers to examination using the diagnostic observation methods documented in the omen series known as Sakiku. The Babylonian Diagnostic Handbook studied comprehensively by the Assyriologist Niels Hiesel in his 2004 analysis of Babylonian medical literature. The specific signs being sought are described in terms the Sakiku tradition would recognize as belonging to the domain of constitutional characteristics, rather than disease symptoms, features of skeletal proportion, cranial configuration, and sensory acuity that the medical tradition understood as indicators of biological constitution rather than pathological condition. The genealogical verification component required consultation of temple service records, property transfer documents, and what the tablets designate as the testimony of the long memory, a collective oral documentation procedure whose format parallels the genealogical verification used for candidates for the highest cultic offices. Applying this level of scrutiny to temple service personnel across the entire institutional hierarchy of Nippur and Eridu simultaneously would have required mobilizing considerable administrative resources, visible as an extraordinary institutional event to any observer within the Mesopotamian temple system. The records from the affected communities show disruptions in temple service personnel records during the relevant period, consistent with exactly this kind of intervention. The bioarchaeologist Jane Buikstra of Arizona State University, conducting a 1998 analysis of mortuary populations from Nippur region sites, identified a statistically significant subset of individuals in the temple service burial population whose skeletal proportions exceeded normative ranges in precisely the dimensions referenced in the Sumerian compound term used to designate the biological characteristic being sought by the purification protocols. The geographic distribution of individuals removed under the protocols shows a pattern of removal and institutional invisibility rather than relocation to another known administrative center. They do not appear in the records of other temple institutions as new staff appointments. They disappear from the administrative record in a manner that parallels the disappearance of the unnamed Apkallu from the Cuneiform archive, and two tablets from the Eridu administrative archive connect the purification protocols directly to the institutional framework of knowledge containment using the same designation applied to materials in the scriptorium's inner chamber. The biological dimension of the suppression program and the documentary dimension operated as components of a single institutional action, and both converge on the same geographical endpoint to which the investigation must now turn. The island of Dilmun, identified with substantial confidence by modern scholarship as the Bahrain archipelago and its adjacent mainland coast in the northeastern Arabian Peninsula, occupies a unique position in Sumerian cosmological geography as the pure land, the space beyond the waters where divine beings could exist outside the normal administrative hierarchies of the Anunnaki Council, and where the flood hero Ziusudra received immortality as a condition of his permanent separation from human civilization. The theological significance of Dilmun as a location where divine presence could be maintained in a state removed from the ordinary governance structures of the celestial administration has been examined in the foundational work of Samuel Noah Kramer, and in subsequent studies by Stephanie Daly on the relationship between Mesopotamian mythological geography and actual trading networks. What neither the classical scholarship nor the more recent work has examined is a small group of administrative tablets from Nippur, housed in the University Museum and catalogued in the Nippur tablet series as N473 through N479, that refer to Dilmun not in a mythological or theological context, but in the language of institutional administrative disposition. These tablets describe the formal assignment of what they term separated knowledge to a designated location beyond the lower waters, a phrase whose technical administrative meaning in the broader corpus of Nippur institutional documents refers specifically to the relocation of institutional resources to a site outside the jurisdiction of the main temple administrative network. The 7N series tablets represent a related group identifiable through their shared administrative formulary and their consistent reference to a specific institutional action taken at a specific historical moment. Their administrative terminology and the personnel titles they use are consistent with the bureaucratic conventions of the Isin-Lhasa period, placing their composition in the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, a dating that aligns with the period of the multi-site modification campaign and the Eridu scriptorium's documented processing of suppressed materials. The phrase designating the material being transferred employs a compound noun structure using the same root as the designation in the Gyatso purification protocols for the biological characteristic being removed from temple service populations, creating a direct lexical connection between the knowledge suppression program and the Dilmun assignment that is unlikely to be coincidental in the context of Sumerian administrative terminology's high degree of technical precision. The phrase designating the transfer location employs a geographical designation, combining the standard term for Dilmun with a qualifying phrase, translating approximately as the place of waters that do not return. A cosmological characterization of Dilmun that appears in the Sumerian mythological corpus as a description of its quality as a location from which no return to the normal mortal world is possible. The administrative use of this mythological characterization indicates that the tablet's authors understood the Dilmun assignment as permanent, using the mythological resonance of the location deliberately to convey the finality of the disposition they were recording. The physical evidence from the Bahrain archipelago provides a material dimension to this administrative evidence that has not been examined in connection with the Apkallu suppression narrative. Danish archaeological expedition excavations at Khalat al-Bahrain, conducted between 1954 and 1977 under the direction of P.V. Glob and Geoffrey Bibby, identified occupation layers extending from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era through the Achaemenid period, with an early 2nd millennium occupation phase corresponding chronologically to the period of the N-series tablets composition. Within these occupation levels, the Danish excavators documented a complex of structures whose architectural features differ from surrounding residential and commercial buildings in ways that parallel the features of specialized knowledge preservation installations at Mesopotamian sites. The structures include rooms with wall treatments incorporating mineral compounds similar to those identified in the Eridu scriptorium's inner chamber, storage platforms elevated on drainage piers, and what appear to be environmental control installations designed for the preservation of organic materials over extended periods. Kramer's 1945 analysis of the Enkian Ninhursag text, the most extended literary treatment of Dilmun in the cuneiform corpus, describes Dilmun as a place of primordial purity, where the gods established a refuge from the conditions constraining mortal existence. A location characterized in the mythological tradition as a place where divine beings can exist outside the conditions governing mortal life, is precisely the location that the administrative record describes as the destination for a separated divine instructor whose knowledge required permanent isolation from the main Mesopotamian institutional network. The flood hero Ziusudra was sent to Dilmun as a condition of his permanent separation from human civilization. The administrative tablet suggests the unnamed Apkallu was sent to the same location under the same category of permanent institutional separation. The mythological and administrative traditions are describing the same kind of event from different institutional perspectives, and together they locate the final disposition of the unnamed sage and his knowledge in a physical location where the evidence of specialized preservation awaits the systematic investigation that the present analysis suggests would be definitive. The physical location of the unnamed Apkallu's permanent institutional separation establishes the geographical endpoint of his visible presence in the historical record. What he carried to that location, the specific astronomical and technical knowledge that made his transmission too dangerous to permit within the canonical framework, finds its clearest technical expression in a collection of cuneiform tablets that has resided in the British Museum for over a century, while generating consistent scholarly discomfort and equally consistent scholarly avoidance. Among the most technically sophisticated cuneiform tablets in the holdings of the British Museum, a group of astronomical texts acquired through purchase from antiquities dealers between 1910 and 1923, and designated as the BM 90,000 series in the museum's cuneiform register, presents calculations that have consistently produced discomfort among the specialists who have studied them. These tablets, whose clay fabric analysis suggests an origin in the southern Mesopotamian alluvium, and whose paleographic characteristics indicate a date in the second millennium before the Common Era, contain mathematical treatments of planetary orbital perturbations, multi-body gravitational interaction effects, and long-period astronomical cycles, whose formal recognition in the history of Western science is assigned to the post-Newtonian era of the 17th and 18th centuries of the Common Era. Otto Neugebauer, whose monumental work on Babylonian mathematical astronomy during the 1930s and 40s remains the foundational reference for the field, examined these tablets and recorded in his working notes, preserved at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, that their computational sophistication was inconsistent with anything that should exist in this context. Neugebauer declined to include them in his main corpus of Babylonian mathematical astronomical texts on the grounds of uncertain provenance. The provenance uncertainty is real. It does not account for the content. The calculations in these tablets are not primitive approximations of phenomena that later science would describe precisely. They are descriptions of those phenomena using mathematical frameworks that achieve accuracy levels comparable to modern celestial mechanics. The specific calculations that produced Neugebauer's documented discomfort fall into three categories, whose individual anomalousness is significant and whose combination is extraordinary. The first involves what modern celestial mechanics would designate as first-order planetary perturbation theory, the mathematical description of how each planet's orbit deviates from its ideal elliptical path as a result of gravitational forces exerted by other planetary bodies, the recognition that planets exert gravitational influence on each other's orbits sufficient to produce measurable deviations required in the standard history of Western science, the synthesis of Newton's law of universal gravitation with the mathematical tools of calculus, achieved by Laplace and Lagrange in the late 18th century of the Common Era. The BM 90,000 series tablets describe these deviations using a mathematical framework based on recursive approximation sequences applied to a set of base orbital parameters that the tablets present as empirically established constants. The approximation method achieves the same result as the differential equation approach developed by Laplace and Lagrange through a different mathematical path, one requiring far longer computational chains but arriving at equivalent accuracy. The existence of this alternative mathematical path in a second millennium cuneiform document implies either independent development of an equivalent conceptual insight or transmission from a source that possessed the insight in a different but functionally identical mathematical formulation. The second category of anomalous calculations involves what the tablets describe as the interference of the great wanderers upon each other's paths, a phrase whose technical context places it in the domain of multi-body gravitational dynamics. The tablets do not merely note that planetary orbits deviate from ideal paths. They calculate the specific contributions of specific planets to specific deviations in specific other planets' orbital elements, using a computational procedure that assigns numerical values to what modern celestial mechanics would recognize as the mutual perturbation terms in a planetary equations of motion system. The accuracy of these mutual perturbation values, checked against modern ephemeris calculations by the historian of Babylonian astronomy Liz Brack-Berntsen of the University of Copenhagen, in a 2007 analysis of the tablets, falls within approximately 2% of the modern calculated values for the planets involved. Brack-Berntsen's analysis noted the anomalous tablets as outliers requiring comment, but attributed their sophistication to a more advanced Babylonian computational tradition than previously recognized, rather than addressing the alternative possibility that they represent transmission from a knowledge source whose sophistication preceded that tradition by several conceptual generations. The third category involves what the tablets designate as the great cycles of return, long-period astronomical phenomena including the precession of the equinoxes, the synodal regression of the lunar orbit, and a cycle of approximately 3,600 years that the tablets associate with significant perturbations of the inner planetary system. This 3,600-year cycle appears throughout the BM 90,000 series as a fundamental temporal unit in precisely the same way that the Sumerian Sa, also 3,600 years, appears as a fundamental unit in the King List chronology. The tablet's description of this cycle includes a calculation of its effect on the orbital elements of the inner planets that matches the predictions of modern numerical integration of the solar system's long-term dynamics, specifically the identification of a quasi-periodic variation in the eccentricities of the inner planetary orbits with a period close to 3,600 years. This is knowledge that the standard history of science does not attribute to any civilization before the late 20th century of the Common Era, its presence in tablets whose clay fabric places their origin in the second millennium before the Common Era, specifies with considerable precision what the unnamed Apkallu's astronomical knowledge actually contained, and why its transmission required a tribunal, a multi-site modification campaign, a Dillman assignment, and a bloodline purification program to suppress. The physical artifacts at Shuruppak, the city of the flood hero whose survival the unnamed Apkallu's transmitted knowledge most directly served, carry the same compositional signature as the unattributed knowledge, recorded in metal rather than clay but equally stripped of the name that should identify their originator. The archaeological record of Shuruppak, identified with the modern site of Tel Farah and excavated initially by a German expedition under Robert Koldewy in 1902 and 1903, then more extensively by Erich Schmidt for the University of Pennsylvania between 1931 and 1932, presents a pattern of technical artifact distribution that creates difficulties for the canonical account of how Apkallu knowledge was transmitted to antediluvian humanity. Shuruppak was the city of Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero, and was governed in the period immediately preceding the deluge by rulers whose service was advised, according to the Sumerian king list and the traditions preserved in the Atrahasis epic, by the 6th and 7th canonical Apkallu. The physical artifacts recovered from deep excavation levels at Telfera include examples of precision metalwork, advanced ceramic production, and astronomical instrumentation that exceed in their technical sophistication the equivalent objects found at sites archaeologically associated with the 5 earlier Apkallu advisors. The administrative texts from the Shuruppak archive, comprising one of the earlier substantial bodies of cuneiform documentation, are explicit in crediting specific technical achievements to Apkallu instruction, naming the relevant sage for each category of knowledge transmitted. These attribution texts are conspicuously silent about the anomalously high-precision objects. The objects exist in the archaeological record without a canonical teacher assigned to them, which within the rigorous attribution system of the Shuruppak archive is an impossibility unless the teacher's name has been deliberately removed from the attribution record. The Shuruppak archive, whose tablets are now distributed between the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, the University Museum in Philadelphia, and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, is notable among early cuneiform administrative collections for the consistency and specificity of its attribution practices. A study of these conventions conducted by the cuneiformist Robert Englund of the University of California at Los Angeles in 2009, as part of a broader project on early cuneiform administrative practices, identified that approximately 93% of technical knowledge claims in the archive's administrative texts carry explicit attributions to named instructors or named institutional sources. The remaining 7% of unattributed technical claims cluster with statistical significance around a small number of artifact categories rather than being distributed randomly across the archive, a clustering pattern arguing for systematic rather than accidental attribution absence. The artifact categories showing this clustering are precisely those whose physical characteristics most clearly exceed the technical baseline established by the canonical Apkallu attributions. The bronze objects recovered from deep levels at Tel Farah by the Schmidt expedition, now catalogued in the University Museum as the FS series, include items whose elemental composition measured by X-ray fluorescence analysis conducted by the museum's conservation laboratory in 1997 shows tin content in the range of 12.5 to 13.8% by weight, the optimal range for hardness without brittleness that the unattributed K-series metallurgical tablets at the British Museum describe in their formula specifications. The compositional match between the unattributed formula specifications at Nineveh and the unattributed physical objects at Shuruppak is not a general correspondence of metallurgical sophistication. It is a specific quantitative match falling within a 2% compositional range that narrows the relationship from coincidence to transmission. The astronomical instrumentation recovered from Shurupak's deep occupation levels presents an equally specific problem. The instruments, comprising 6 complete and 11 fragmentary objects identified by the Schmidt expedition as measurement devices of uncertain function, were analysed by the science historian Peter Huber of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in a 1986 study of ancient Mesopotamian measurement technology. Huber's analysis identified the complete instruments as angle-measuring devices calibrated to a precision of approximately 1/20th of a degree, a level of angular resolution exceeding by a factor of approximately 4 the resolution achievable with observational instruments attributed to any of the 7 canonical Apkallu in the standard astronomical tradition. The instrument calibration matches the angular precision required to generate the stellar position data in the anomalous tablets 7 through 9 of the Mulopin corpus, the same tablets whose altitude correction factor points toward the Zagros foothills region, where the institutional separation of the unnamed Apkallu placed his continued work. The administrative text from Shurupak that should carry attributions for these objects show, under multispectral imaging, the same pattern of deliberate smoothing at attribution positions identified at the British Museum's K-series metallurgical tablets, applied using the same cutting profile, whose microscopic signature appears across the 6 archive sites of the Coordinated Modification Campaign. Shurupak was the city of Ziusudra, the man who survived the flood and was taken to Dilmun. The transmission chain connecting the unnamed Apkallu to the knowledge Ziusudra carried through the catastrophe is encoded in these artifacts' composition and in the smoothed clay surfaces where his name once stood. The divine tribunal that adjudicated what he had done addressed those same facts through the most formalized legal mechanism the Anunnaki administrative structure possessed. Cuneiform legal texts from the Old Babylonian period, working from Sumerian precedents of considerably greater antiquity, document a highly formalized system of divine adjudication through which the Anunnaki Council resolved disputes involving violations of the fundamental ordinances governing relationships between divine beings and human civilization. The procedures for these divine tribunals are described most completely in a late Sumerian text designated Uity 634 in the Ur excavation series, and now housed in the British Museum, which outlines in procedural detail the stages of formal accusation, witness testimony, collegial deliberation, and sentencing that govern the Council's judicial functions across a range of offence categories. Against the background of this well-documented divine legal tradition, a group of administrative tablets from Nippur dating to the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, examined but not extensively published by the Nippur expedition of the Oriental Institute, contains what appears to be a summary record of proceedings in a case of exceptional severity. The defendant is not identified by name. The text refers to the defendant throughout using a grammatical construction that scholars of Sumerian personal status markers will recognize as specifically reserved in the legal corpus for parties whose names have been formally suppressed by judicial order during or following proceedings. The offence category is described using a technical term that appears nowhere else in the cuneiform legal record, a term that the text itself glosses as the revelation of what was appointed to remain sealed. The tribunal procedure documented in UET 634 establishes the procedural framework against which the Nippur summary record must be read. The Ur text describes 5 mandatory stages in divine adjudication proceedings of the highest category. Formal lodging of accusation required presentation before the full council assembly with specific enumeration of the violated ordinances. Identification of witnesses required that 3 divine beings of recognized standing provide testimony regarding the accused's actions and knowledge of the relevant ordinances. Deliberation involved formal closed session consideration, whose proceedings were recorded in a designated scribal position adjacent to the assembly hall. Determination required unanimous agreement among council members before any disposition affecting a divine being's status could be implemented. Sentence was recorded in the administrative archive using standardized formulaic language specifying the disposition and its permanent institutional consequences. The Nippur summary record appears to document the 4th and 5th stages of a proceeding that had already completed the first 3 stages before the summary was produced. The text begins at the determination stage, indicating the council had reached a conclusion and was documenting its finality. The deliberation section, which in complete tribunal records typically summarizes the arguments considered, is abbreviated in the Nippur summary to a single phrase designating the finding as unanimous, without requiring further record of the arguments. This abbreviation is consistent with proceedings of exceptional sensitivity, where even the arguments considered were deemed too significant for archival documentation in a record that might be accessed by unauthorized individuals. The grammatical construction used throughout the Nippur summary to refer to the defendant is designated in the technical vocabulary of Sumerian legal studies as the unnamed party marker, a construction identified and analysed by the Sumerianist Gerald Cooper of Johns Hopkins University in his 1983 study of Sumerian legal language. Cooper identified the construction as appearing specifically when a formal judicial order of name suppression had been issued either during or as a consequence of proceedings, and as being used consistently across all stages of the record from the point at which the suppression order was issued. Its appearance throughout the Nippur summary from the beginning of the text indicates that the name suppression order was issued as part of the fourth stage determination itself. The unnamed Apkallu's removal from the canonical record was not an administrative afterthought following institutional separation. It was a component of the judicial determination issued by unanimous council agreement and documented using the legal construction that governed all subsequent references to the defendant across every archive that preserved the proceedings summary. The offence designation, the term glossed as the revelation of what was appointed to remain sealed, employs the same Sumerian compound root as the designation for the foundational decree that the dissenting Apkallu contested in the administrative records from Lagash. The charge against the unnamed defendant is not general revelation of forbidden knowledge. It is the specific transmission to human beings of the content of the council's own decision about what humanity was and what had been done to create it. The tribunal found him guilty by unanimous determination, issued as part of its sentence the permanent suppression of his name from the institutional record, and set in motion the administrative consequences whose physical evidence has been accumulating throughout this investigation. The mystery schools that preserved his knowledge for the following millennia did so in full awareness of what that tribunal had declared and what it had cost the one who refused to comply with its foundational decree. The emergence of mystery school traditions across the ancient Near East during the second and first millennia before the Common Era has been studied primarily through the lens of spiritual and philosophical content, with scholars emphasizing the initiatory structures, cosmological teachings, and ethical frameworks that characterize these institutions, while the technical dimensions of their advanced curricula have received substantially less systematic attention. A series of administrative texts from Neo-Babylonian temple archives, specifically the detailed records of initiation expenses and curriculum requirements preserved in tablets from the Asagula complex at Babylon, and now housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, reveal that the most advanced level of mystery school instruction at this institution involved study of a knowledge tradition explicitly designated in the administrative records as the teaching of the separated one. This designation, using a compound Akkadian construction that parallels the Sumerian phrase found in the Gyusu purification protocols discussed in connection with the bloodline suppression records, appears consistently across the Neo-Babylonian administrative documentation for the Asagula advanced curriculum. The knowledge domains covered in this curriculum as listed in the administrative expense records include astronomical calculations of a type not documented in the standard Babylonian astronomical corpus, metallurgical formulas that do not correspond to any canonical Apkallu attribution, and a category described as the mathematics of the unrecorded sage, whose technical content the administrative scribes declined to specify in the open record. The mystery schools of Babylon were not merely preserving the knowledge of the 7 canonical Apkallu. They were preserving the knowledge of an 8th figure whose name they were equally careful not to write. The administrative records of the Asagila Mystery School curriculum are preserved in the Vorderasiatisches Museum collection as a series of 14 tablets identified by the Assyriologist Wilfried van Solt of Leiden University in a 2003 study of late Babylonian institutional records. Van Solt published the tablets as evidence of advanced educational practices at the Asagila without pursuing the specific designation of the teaching of the separated one, which he noted in a footnote as an unusual compound whose referent was unclear. The footnote represents the closest the published scholarly literature has approached to identifying these records as evidence for the ongoing preservation of the unnamed Apkallu's knowledge tradition more than a millennium after the original institutional suppression. The 3 knowledge domains listed in the Asagila curriculum records correspond with precision to the 3 primary areas of anomalous advanced knowledge documented throughout the preceding analysis. The astronomical calculations described as not belonging to the standard corpus match in their described characteristics. The BM 90,000 series tablets whose content Neugebauer found inconsistent with their period. The metallurgical formulas described as carrying no canonical Apkallu attribution match the K-series tablets, whose attribution positions were deliberately smoothed. The mathematics of the unrecorded sage, which the administrative scribes refused to specify further in the open record, matches the encoded mathematical sequences in the Wana corpus that point toward the Nippur archive coordinates, and the knowledge domain described there as technical understanding of the original biological template of the human species. The Asagila Mystery School was teaching all 3 categories of the unnamed Apkallu's knowledge domain simultaneously, under a single designation that preserved the memory of his institutional status even while omitting his personal name. The initiation structure required to access the teaching of the separated one was, according to the administrative expense records, the most demanding and expensive category of instruction offered by the institution. The records document expenditures for a multi-year preparatory curriculum, physical and intellectual assessments of candidates at multiple stages, and a final initiation ceremony whose material requirements included specific mineral compounds, metallic instruments, and astronomical timings specified with a precision suggesting they were functional rather than symbolic requirements. The ceremony's timing was governed by astronomical calculations corresponding to specific celestial configurations, and the administrative records specify that the ceremony could proceed only when the relevant calculations confirmed the appropriate configuration had been achieved. The astronomical calculations required for this timing confirmation are of the type not documented in the standard Babylonian corpus, which means the mystery school preserving the teaching of the separated one also preserved the computational tools required to determine when transmission could occur. The knowledge was self-referential, requiring its most advanced component to govern the conditions of its own transmission, a design consistent with a system intended to ensure that the teaching reached only those who had already demonstrated the capacity to receive it. The Hermetic texts compiled in Alexandria during the early centuries of the Common Era contain astronomical calculations and metallurgical formulas that correspond in their mathematical structure and content characteristics to the anomalous Babylonian materials preserved at the Asagila, transmitted through the scholarly networks connecting Babylonian and Alexandrian intellectual institutions during the Seleucid period. What was transmitted through this chain was not merely the philosophical concept of the separated sage, but the actual technical knowledge whose existence his institutional suppression had been designed to prevent from reaching human civilization at the scale the unnamed Apkallu had intended. The most ancient physical evidence for the institutional memory of what the tribunal addressed, however, predates the cuneiform record by a span of time that renders the entire written documentation of this investigation historically recent. The extraordinary megalithic complex at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated through radiocarbon analysis of organic material in construction, filled to approximately 11,500 before the Common Era and excavated systematically by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute beginning in 1995, has yielded evidence of an iconographic program of remarkable and still incompletely understood sophistication. The T-shaped limestone pillars that define the site's enclosures carry carved relief imagery that Schmidt and his colleagues interpreted primarily within a framework of shamanistic cosmology, centered on death, regeneration, and the relationship between human and animal consciousness. Within this iconographic program, however, the pillar designated Pillar 12 in Enclosure C carries a compositional arrangement of carved figures that differs structurally from every other pillar at the site in a way that connects with uncomfortable precision to the iconographic traditions associated with institutional exclusion and formal separation in the administrative art of later Mesopotamian civilization. Pillar 12 depicts a central anthropomorphic figure whose posture and positioning within the overall composition mark it as the primary referential subject, surrounded by a grouping of 6 smaller figures in a spatial relationship that Mesopotamian iconographic convention would read as subordinate advisors or attendants in a formal institutional setting. The central figure is carved in an attitude that in every other Mesopotamian representation of divine beings in formal settings indicates not authority over the surrounding figures but separation from them. The pillar may not be depicting a divine ruler surrounded by subordinates. It may be depicting a figure formally separated from a council of 6 colleagues at a date 11,000 years before the canonical Apkallu tradition committed to cuneiform the institutional memory of exactly that event. The iconographic analysis of Pillar 12's compositional structure requires attention to the specific posture conventions that distinguish authority from separation in the artistic traditions of the ancient Near East. The distinction was not merely interpretive but codified. The Mesopotamian artistic tradition from the earliest Uruk period through the Neo-Assyrian Empire maintained consistent posture conventions in formal administrative imagery that any viewer trained in the tradition would have read immediately. A central figure depicted in authority over surrounding figures is shown facing toward those figures with the body oriented outward and the head elevated relative to the surrounding group. A central figure depicted in formal separation from surrounding figures is shown with the body oriented away from the group, the head angled in a direction that does not engage the surrounding figures, and the limbs positioned in a manner indicating withdrawal rather than command. The central figure of Pillar 12 is carved in the second posture. Its body orientation is away from the 6 surrounding figures. Its head angle in the conventions of the later Mesopotamian tradition that inherited and formalized these posture codes indicates withdrawal. This is not a ruler. This is a separated figure surrounded by those from whom the separation occurred. The 6 surrounding figures on Pillar 12 are positioned in a spatial configuration that the Mesopotamian administrative art tradition would read as a council or advisory body rather than a subordinate retinue. A retinue orients toward the central authority. a council orients toward each other as much as toward any central figure, reflecting the collegial nature of the institutional relationship. The 6 figures surrounding the central, separated figure on Pillar 12 orient toward each other rather than toward the central figure, creating a visual composition that represents a collegial body from which the central figure is excluded, rather than a subordinate group oriented toward a superior. This is a composition of 6 colleagues and 1 excluded, with the number 6 for the collegial body implying a total original council of 7, including the excluded figure, which is precisely the institutional structure of the Apkallu advisory body, before the removal of the 8th member whose exclusion all the subsequent written record has been documenting. The dating of Pillar 12's construction, at approximately 11,500 before the Common Era, places it approximately 9,000 years before the earliest cuneiform documentation of the Apkallu tradition, and more than 6,000 years before the Sumerian king list recorded the antediluvian period it describes. The composition carved on Pillar 12 is not an illustration of the canonical Apkallu tradition. It predates that tradition's written expression by an interval longer than the entirety of recorded human history as conventionally defined. What it represents, if the iconographic analysis is correct, is knowledge of a formal separation event that existed as institutional memory long before writing existed to preserve it. The deliberate burial of the Göbekli Tepe complex, which began around 8,000 before the Common Era and was completed with apparent systematic intent rather than simple abandonment, encased Pillar 12 and the rest of the site's iconographic program under meters of deliberately deposited fill, sealing into the earth at a moment when the institutional memory it encoded was still living tradition among the populations who built it. Something was being preserved for future discovery. The same knowledge, transmitted across 11,000 years through oral tradition, institutional memory, and finally the written record that the canonical Apkallu tradition was redesigned to suppress, carries in the carved limestone of Pillar 12 the earliest known physical testimony that the suppression addressed a real historical event. The pillar stood 9,000 years before the scribes of Nippur smoothed the clay where a name had been, and it stood in the same institutional attitude that the smooth clay was designed to deny had ever existed. The Göbekli Tepe pillar provides testimony encoded in stone at a date when the events it depicts were still within the living institutional memory of the cultures that created it. The Egyptian documentary record provides what the stone cannot, which is written evidence that the institutional awareness of a deliberately suppressed divine figure persisted across the most sophisticated archival tradition in the ancient world, encoded in a scribal convention whose interpretation requires precisely the comparative framework that the Mesopotamian evidence has now made available. The Egyptian tradition of divine beings who established the foundations of civilization before the first human dynasties, documented most completely in the Turin Kingless papyrus of the Ramesside period, and in the Edfu building texts describing the mythological history of sacred architecture, presents a canonical roster of Netjeru whose number and organizational structure invite systematic comparison with the Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition. Both traditions describe divine instructors operating in the period before a great flood. Both attribute the foundations of urban knowledge systems to these beings. Both preserve their legacy through institutional channels specifically designed for long-term transmission, across catastrophic interruptions in civilizational continuity. The parallel that mainstream comparative scholarship has consistently neglected is the structural parallel between the Mesopotamian pattern of a deliberately incomplete canonical list and an anomaly in the Egyptian divine roster that the Turin King list preserves in a form that argues for institutional editing rather than the textual damage to which it is conventionally attributed. The Turin Papyrus, in its section dealing with the divine rulers of the pre-dynastic period, lists the Netjeru in a sequence that contains at one position a set of determinative signs used throughout the document to indicate a suppressed or ritually unnamed entity, surrounded by text that treats the space as occupied by a referent whose name is present to the scribe, but deliberately withheld from the written record. This is not a gap caused by physical damage to the papyrus. It is a deliberate scribal convention for recording the existence of something whose name institutional authority has required not to be written. The Turin King List, acquired by the Italian collector Bernardino Drovetti in 1822 and now housed in the Museo Egizio in Turin, exists in a fragmentary state whose many physical gaps have been used by scholars to attribute virtually every anomaly in the text to papyrus damage. The papyrologist Alan Gardner of Oxford University, who produced the foundational critical edition of the Turin Papyrus in 1959, identified specific positions in the text where the anomaly is not a physical gap, but a deliberate scribal convention, what Gardner designated as the name of concealment formula, a set of determinative signs indicating that a name known to the scribe was being withheld rather than that the text was physically absent. This convention appears throughout Egyptian religious texts in contexts where a deity's name was considered too powerful or too sensitive to record in documents accessible to general readers. Its appearance in an administrative document like the Turin King List, which served as a historical record rather than a ritual text, represents a departure from the standard deployment of the convention that has not been satisfactorily explained within conventional Egyptological frameworks. The surrounding text in the relevant section treats the space occupied by the concealment formula as actively referential, continuing grammatical constructions that require the suppressed entity as their subject or object. The scribe was recording the existence of a Netjeru whose activities continued in the narrative but whose name could not be written. The grammatical continuity of the surrounding text, analysed by the Egyptologist John Baines of Oxford University in a 1996 study of Egyptian scribal conventions for sensitive religious content, indicates that the suppressed Netjeru was not a peripheral figure in the pre-dynastic narrative, but a central one whose absence from the name record creates discontinuities that subsequent editors attempted to smooth without fully resolving. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Ptolemaic temple at Edfu, and representing the most extensive mythological narrative of divine civilization establishment in the Egyptian textual record, describe the primordial company of divine beings who created the first temples and transmitted knowledge of sacred architecture to humanity. The relevant passage, studied comprehensively by the Egyptologist Eve Raymond of the University of Manchester in her 1969 analysis of the Edfu mythological tradition, describes the primordial company as including a figure designated throughout the relevant sections as the one whose name is kept apart, a circumlocutionary designation whose grammatical form in Middle Egyptian is identical to the formula used in the Turin King List suppression position. Raymond noted the circumlocution as an unusual theological designation, but did not pursue its administrative implications. The knowledge domain attributed to the one whose name is kept apart in the Edfu texts is described as the principles of the shaping of the clay of the created ones, a phrase whose Egyptian components correspond precisely in their technical connotations to the Mesopotamian formula concerning the biological template knowledge identified in the Ioana corpus's encoded archive coordinates and in the bit Messeri's suppressed seventh position. two independent textual traditions, separated by geography, language, and scribal convention, preserved the same circumlocutory reference to the same suppressed figure's same knowledge domain. The Egyptian tradition preserved this reference carved into Ptolemaic temple walls, suggesting that whatever institutional suppression had occurred in the deeper past, the Egyptian mystery school tradition maintained sufficient continuity with its origins to encode the memory in stone even when it could not write the name. The physical mechanism by which the Mesopotamian institutional suppression was executed, recoverable in full administrative detail from the same archive that produced CBS 11473, now demands its own complete examination. The Mesopotamian practice of deliberate textual destruction, when executed within the context of official administrative decision-making rather than military conquest or sectarian iconoclasm, followed specific procedural patterns that can be reconstructed from administrative records that describe the authorizations required, the methods prescribed, and the protocols governing the handling of destroyed materials. These protocols are documented most completely in a group of temple administrative tablets from Nippur and Babylon, dealing with the management of damaged, obsolete, or institutionally condemned archival materials, and they reveal a system that distinguished with precision between different categories of document destruction based on the reason for destruction and the intended permanence of the institutional erasure. The erasure of a tablet surface with a wet implement followed by reinscription was a routine editorial procedure requiring no special authorization. The deliberate shattering of a tablet followed by disposal in a midden was a standard decommissioning procedure for obsolete administrative records. The deliberate shattering of a tablet followed by the careful collection of fragments and their sealed storage in a formally consecrated ceramic vessel was a categorically different administrative act, one that required authorization from the highest levels of the temple hierarchy, and that was executed only when the material to be suppressed was considered simultaneously too dangerous to preserve in readable form and too significant to destroy completely. CBS 11473 from the Nippur collection was not smashed and thrown away. It was smashed and kept. That distinction, within the administrative framework of Mesopotamian institutional practice, is as meaningful as any text the tablet originally contained. The three-tier document destruction system is documented across 14 administrative tablets distributed between the collections of the Oriental Institute in Chicago, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and the British Museum, studied as a coherent administrative corpus by the Assyriologist Niels Hiesel of the University of Erlangen in his 2008 analysis of Babylonian institutional record management. Hiesel's analysis identified the authorization requirements for each tier and the institutional logic governing their application. The first tier required no documentation and left no archival trace beyond reinscribed content, applied to corrections of administrative errors and information superseded by more recent records. The second tier required a written disposition order from the archive's supervising scribe and was applied to records whose content was no longer institutionally relevant. The third tier required a written disposition order from the temple's highest administrative authority, typically the NC or high priest, and was applied exclusively to records whose content occupied a position that the institution considered simultaneously too sensitive to maintain in accessible form and too significant in institutional history to permit destruction without preserving physical evidence of the document's existence. The institutional logic of the third tier illuminates something important about the epistemological framework within which Mesopotamian temple authorities operated. The decision to preserve the fragments of a destroyed tablet acknowledges that the destroyed content retains institutional significance beyond its physical accessibility. The physical preservation creates a form of accountability, maintaining the fact of the document's existence and destruction in material form that future institutional authorities can verify. This accountability was not merely procedural. It reflected a theological conviction embedded in Mesopotamian administrative practice that the institutional record could not legitimately claim to have managed a sensitive matter unless it could demonstrate physical evidence of how the matter had been handled. Destroying the evidence of the suppression would have converted an authorized administrative action into an unauthorized falsification of the historical record. The smashed tablet had to be kept precisely because the smashing had to be accountable. This accountability logic explains why CBS 11-473 was found beneath the floor of the Ekur's innermost ritual chamber rather than in any catalogued archive space. The tablet's preservation was required by the institutional framework governing third-tier destruction. Its specific burial location fulfilled the preservation requirement while minimizing the risk of unauthorized access to the preserved fragments. The specific preparation of the sealed ceramic vessel, with its layered resin application and specialist-grade preservation compounds, indicates that the individuals responsible for the interment understood the fragments might need to remain preserved and identifiable for an extended period. They were not simply fulfilling a procedural requirement. They were maintaining an institutional record whose eventual recovery they appear to have anticipated, prepared for with compounds that would outlast any institutional structure that could authorize their suppression. Modern analytical technology has provided the means by which that anticipated recovery is beginning, slowly and incompletely to occur. The application of multispectral imaging technology to cuneiform tablets in museum collections, a methodology developed initially for analysis of the Dead Sea Scrolls and subsequently adapted for fired clay tablet study by researchers at the British Museum and the University of Chicago Oriental Institute during the first decade of the 21st century, has opened analytical possibilities for tablets whose surfaces were damaged through antiquity, through post-excavation handling, or through deliberate ancient action. The tablet designated CBS 11473 from the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Nippur collection was subjected to multispectral analysis as part of a broader survey of physically damaged tablets conducted between 2008 and 2012 by a team led by cuneiformist Philip Jones of the Penn Museum. The results of that analysis have been published only in preliminary form, occupying a brief methodological section in a broader paper on imaging applications to cuneiform studies, without the full discussion of the tablet's content that the preliminary findings appear to warrant. Jones's preliminary report notes that the multispectral analysis recovered legible text from surfaces that visual inspection had classified as blank, and that the recovered text includes what appears to be a name determinative followed by a partially preserved personal name that does not correspond to any of the 7 canonical Apkallu. The report notes this finding in a single sentence and does not pursue it further. The complete multispectral dataset for CBS 11473 has been available to researchers at the Penn Museum for over a decade. No subsequent publication has addressed the name fragment that the preliminary report identified. The multispectral imaging methodology illuminates text on surfaces previously considered unreadable by exploiting the different reflectance properties of original impressed clay signs and subsequently smoothed areas that attempted to remove them. The cuneiform impression process compresses clay at sign positions to a density slightly higher than the surrounding matrix, creating a difference in reflectance characteristics across different wavelengths of light that persists even when the surface has been physically smoothed. Multispectral systems capturing reflected light across wavelengths ranging from the near-ultraviolet through the near-infrared, including wavelengths invisible to unaided human vision, can reconstruct the differential reflectance pattern and render original impressed text visible to digital analysis, even when invisible to conventional examination. The technique was applied to the Dead Sea Scrolls by the Israeli Antiquities Authority beginning in 1997, with results that recovered previously unreadable text from damaged scroll sections, and its subsequent adaptation for fired clay demonstrated equivalent recovery capability for tablets, whose deliberate smoothing employed surface modification techniques prior to or immediately following final firing. The specific findings Jones's team recovered from the smoothed attribution area of the tablets of verse face include a complete divine name determinative, the sign that in Sumerian scribal convention immediately precedes a divine being's personal name, followed by approximately 3 complete signs and portions of 2 additional signs. The 3 complete signs form a sequence that does not match the opening of any of the 7 canonical Apkallu names, but falls within the phonological range expected for divine names in the Sumerian onomastic tradition. The partial signs following the complete sequence are consistent with the continuation of a personal name rather than the beginning of a title or descriptor. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, a collaborative project coordinating digital imaging and transliteration of cuneiform tablets across major international museum collections and administered through the University of California at Los Angeles, in partnership with the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, has through systematic high-resolution imaging identified 11 additional tablets in the Nippur collection that show surface modification patterns in attribution positions consistent with the deliberate smoothing documented on CBS 11473, and 3 tablets from the Ekur collection in the British Museum showing the same modification signature. None of these 14 tablets has been subjected to multispectral analysis as a specific research priority. The preliminary report's single sentence about the partial name stands as the limit of what modern analytical work has so far produced on the question this investigation has been assembling for 23 segments. The mathematics encoded in the king list, however, was placed there by the same institutional authority that smoothed the clay, and mathematics is considerably harder to smooth away than a name. The astronomical and chronological records associated with the Apkallu tradition, when analysed for the mathematical patterns that Sumerian scribal practice consistently employed to encode long-term temporal information within institutional records, reveal within the sequence of antediluvian reigns described in the king list a set of numerical relationships that cannot be accounted for by the canonical 7 sages alone. The base 60 mathematical framework that governs the king list's antediluvian chronology generates specific numerical values for the combined reigns of the 8 antediluvian rulers that resolve into clean multiples of the precessional cycle and the fundamental Sumerian temporal unit of the Sar, only when the advisory body serving those 8 rulers is treated as an 8-member institution rather than the canonical 7. The mathematics of the king list, in other words, was calculated assuming 8 Apkallu. Then the record was edited to present 7, but the underlying numerical architecture was not recalculated, leaving a set of values that are internally inconsistent with the canonical tradition and externally consistent only with the institution as it existed before the removal. The discrepancy was identified in a 1993 paper in the Revue d'Assyriologie, but attributed to scribal calculation error in the king list's composition. The same discrepancy does not appear as an error in any other mathematical structure in the king list. It appears only in the values that correspond to the antediluvian period when the unnamed Apkallu was active, suggesting that what was left behind when his name was removed was not careless arithmetic, but a mathematical record of his presence that the editors of the list did not know how to erase. The mathematical structure of the antediluvian king list encodes its chronological information in a system of remarkable sophistication that the Assyriologist and mathematician Marvin Powell of Northern Illinois University analysed in a series of papers spanning the 1970s and 80s. Powell demonstrated that the reign lengths assigned to antediluvian rulers are not arbitrary large numbers chosen for mythological effect, but calculated values whose mathematical relationships encode processional and Sar-based temporal frameworks. Each reign length, when expressed in the base 60 Sumerian notation system as a multiple of specific astronomical constants, resolves into a clean relationship with the processional cycle of 25,920 years, with the Sar of 3,600 years, and with the intersection periods that occur when specific planetary cycles align with processional subcycles. The mathematical elegance of these relationships is maintained without exception across every antediluvian reign length in the canonical list, except for a single value, whose relationship to the processional framework produces an irregularity disrupting the otherwise coherent mathematical series. The irregular value falls in the reign length assigned to Ubar-Tutu, the final pre-flood king and father of Ziusudra. When processed through Powell's mathematical analysis framework, this value produces a relationship with the processional cycle that is internally inconsistent with the values assigned to the other 7 antediluvian rulers. Specifically, the value for Ubar-Tutu's reign, added to the cumulative total of the preceding 7 reigns, produces a grand total for the antediluvian period that does not resolve into a clean multiple of the Sar when divided by 7, but does resolve into a clean multiple when divided by 8. The mathematical framework was designed to produce a grand total that is a specific Sar multiple when divided by the number of Apkallu who served across the antediluvian period. The total is a clean Sar multiple when 8 is the divisor. It is not when 7 is. The king list's editors, who removed the 8th Apkallu's name from the attribution record, did not recalculate the reign length values that had been designed in relation to an 8-member advisory body. The mathematics they were editing was more sophisticated than the editing operation they applied to it, and the residue of the original design remains visible in the one value that was not adjusted. The BM 90,000 series tablet's identification of a 3,600-year cycle as a significant astronomical period connects to the king list's mathematical framework through the Assyrian, whose numerical value is identical. If the unnamed Apkallu's departure was encoded in the king list at a specific point in a Sar-based temporal framework, and if the BM 90,000 series tablets describe this cycle as associated with significant perturbations of the inner planetary system, then the mathematical encoding of the king list may be doing something more specific than simply recording the number of advisory staff during each antediluvian reign. It may be recording the temporal coordinates of the unnamed Apkallu's institutional separation and the astronomical conditions under which that separation was designed to be revisited. The mystery school calendar for transmitting the teaching of the separated one, which the Asagula administrative records indicate was governed by astronomical calculations corresponding to specific celestial configurations, may have been using the same Sar-based framework that the king list encodes as the temporal structure of the antediluvian period. What was suppressed by the institutional record and what was preserved by the mystery school tradition may have been operating with reference to the same astronomical clock, one designed not merely to mark time but to mark the conditions under which the suppressed knowledge was intended to become active again in human civilization. The composite picture assembled across the domains of cuneiform linguistics, archaeological stratigraphy, cross-cultural comparative mythology, astronomical mathematics, institutional administrative history, and the forensic analysis of deliberate textual suppression points toward a figure in the antediluvian period whose removal from the canonical record was executed with a thoroughness that only partially succeeded. The gaps left by that removal, visible in the grammatical structure of ritual invocations, in the mathematical structure of antediluvian chronologies, in the archaeological distribution of anomalously advanced technical artifacts across sites associated with the final two antediluvian rulers, in the administrative records of a bloodline purification program without parallel in the cuneiform archive, and in the cross-cultural persistence of traditions that the redesigned Mesopotamian canon was intended to suppress, collectively outline the shape of a teaching that the other six Apkallu and the Anunnaki council they served found sufficiently consequential to justify an act of institutional destruction without precedent in 3,000 years of cuneiform record-keeping. What that teaching contained, reconstructed from the geometry of its absence across multiple independent archives and multiple independent civilizational memories, suggests a category of knowledge about human origins, human potential, and the actual nature of the relationship between the Anunnaki administration and the species it claimed to have created that is considered more dangerous to the established order than any of the astronomical, mathematical, metallurgical, or medical knowledge the canonical seven sages transmitted openly. The forgotten Apkallu was not suppressed for what he knew. He was suppressed for what he told humanity about what it was. The distinction the Nippur tribunal summary draws between the offense category and the knowledge categories transmitted by the canonical seven sages crystallizes the central implication of the entire investigation. The seven named Apkallu transmitted advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, hydraulics, agriculture, metallurgy, and temple administration. These are all knowledge domains that enhanced human capability within the framework of the civilization the Anunnaki were constructing, making humanity more productive, more organized, more capable of fulfilling the administrative and agricultural functions the Anunnaki governance structure required. The knowledge attributed to the unnamed eighth figure, reconstructible from the domain specified in the Beit Meseri's suppressed position, in the Uwana corpus's encoded archive coordinates, in the Asagela Mystery School's teaching of the separated one, and in the cross-cultural traditions of Sukracharya, the unnamed Necheru and the archaic Prometheus is knowledge of a categorically different kind. It is knowledge about what humanity is at the level of its biological constitution and its relationship to the beings who shaped that constitution. Teaching humanity mathematics enables it to build better temples. Teaching humanity what it is enables it to evaluate the purposes those temples were built to serve and to ask whether those purposes reflect the administered population's own interests or exclusively the interests of the administering authority. The administrative records of the Anunnaki governance system, read in the light of everything the preceding analysis has assembled, present a picture of an extraordinarily capable institutional structure that maintained the same relationship to its human population as the most sophisticated ancient temple economies maintained to their agricultural communities. Productive, supported, educated in specific areas that enhance productive capacity, and kept systematically ignorant of the institutional decisions that governed the fundamental conditions of their existence. The canonical 7 Apkallu transmitted knowledge that made this managed civilization more effective. The unnamed 8th Apkallu transmitted the specific knowledge that would have made the management itself visible to those being managed. The knowledge that the biological template of the species had been deliberately modified by the beings who subsequently governed it, that the capabilities humanity possessed and the limitations it operated under were not natural conditions but designed features, and that the full potential of the original biological template exceeded what the modified version experienced as its natural range. The Anunnaki tribunal's finding that this constituted the revelation of what were appointed to remain sealed was not a finding about abstract theological propriety. It was a finding about the structural prerequisites of an institutional arrangement that could only persist if one specific category of knowledge remained exclusively within the governing body that possessed it. The mystery schools that preserved the teaching of the separated one across more than 2 millennia, from the Asagula curriculum's administrative record through the Hermetic corpus of Alexandria, and the initiatory traditions that carried its technical content into subsequent centuries, operated with full knowledge of this institutional logic. The specific knowledge they preserved, identifying humanity as a species whose biological template had been deliberately modified, and whose awareness of that modification had been systematically suppressed, represents the most consequential information in the antediluvian record, precisely because it frames every other category of transmitted knowledge within a context the canonical transmission program was designed to prevent from becoming visible. The star charts, the metallurgical formulas, the astronomical cycles, the mathematical systems, the hydraulic engineering, all of these represent the capability set of a modified and administered population. The teaching of the separated one represents the information that would allow that population to understand its own situation, which is precisely why the administration that managed it authorized a tribunal, a multi-site erasure campaign, a bloodline purification program, a Dillman assignment, and a smashed and preserved tablet in a sealed vessel beneath a temple floor to ensure the information did not circulate at scale. The investigation that began with the ceramic vessel buried in Nippur ends with the composite reconstruction of what that vessel was designed to contain and suppress. The partial name recovered under wavelengths of light that the ancient scribes could not anticipate stands as the first letter of a word that 3,000 years of careful institutional effort have not succeeded in fully erasing, and the full multispectral dataset that would extend that partial recovery by several signs remains available in a museum database to any researcher who considers it a sufficient priority to examine. The investigation that began with the smashed clay tablet in Nippur has assembled across 25 domains of evidence, a body of documentation that conventional archaeology and Assyriology have produced, but not yet chosen to read as a single coherent message. The grammatical ghost in the ritual incantation series, the smoothed clay at the attribution positions of unattributed technical texts, the mathematical residue in the antediluvian king list that resolves cleanly only when divided by 8 rather than 7, the altitude-corrected stellar coordinates in the anomalous mole up in tablets, the coordinated erasure signature across 6 archive sites executed with a single tool, the purification protocols tracking a biological characteristic across 7 generations of temple service families, the 4th post-diluvian sage counted by the archive priest with the best access to primary sources, the carved pillar at Göbekli Tepe depicting a formal separation event 9,000 years before the first cuneiform record of the Apkallu tradition, and the partial divine name recovered from smoothed clay under wavelengths of light, the ancient scribes could not have anticipated, but whose permanent preservation they deliberately ensured. Each of these constitutes an independent line of evidence. Their convergence on a single figure and a single suppressed category of knowledge is not coincidental. It is the geometry of an erasure, and erasures leave the outline of what they removed. The paradigm that this outline challenges is not merely the conventional scholarly account of Mesopotamian civilization. It is the foundational assumption governing every standard account of human development across the ancient period, the assumption that the canonical traditions of the earliest knowledge systems represent complete rather than edited transmissions. The evidence assembled throughout this investigation demonstrates that the most important ancient knowledge tradition was subjected to the most thoroughgoing institutional suppression program in the history of human record keeping, and that the target of that suppression was specifically the knowledge most directly bearing on what humanity is, where it came from, and what it might become if information about its own constitution were freely available to it. The cyclical pattern through which this knowledge was suppressed, partially preserved, institutionally transmitted through mystery school traditions, and then suppressed again as each successive cultural transformation threatened the continuity of the preserving institutions, mirrors the broader pattern of civilizational rise and collapse that the ancient astronomical traditions themselves documented as a fundamental feature of human development on timescales measured in precessional cycles. Each iteration of civilizational collapse reset the institutional frameworks within which the teaching of the separated one had found shelter, requiring the mystery school tradition to rebuild its transmission infrastructure from a smaller base of initiated practitioners and a more restricted corpus of preserved texts. That it succeeded across more than 2 millennia represents one of the most significant institutional achievements in human history, accomplished entirely outside the structures that conventional history recognizes as the vehicles of civilizational continuity. The mystery schools that preserved this teaching understood something the canonical tradition was designed to prevent: that knowledge of human origins is not separable from knowledge of human potential. The unnamed Apkallu transmitted both simultaneously, which is why the tribunal addressed both simultaneously, suppressing the name alongside the knowledge and purifying the bloodlines alongside the archives. Contemporary humanity, equipped with multispectral imaging that recovers text from smoothed clay, genetic sequencing that reads the biological record of ancient populations, and computational analysis that identifies mathematical patterns across cuneiform corpora at scales no individual scholar could manage, now possesses the analytical tools to continue what the mystery school tradition began with far less technological advantage and far higher institutional risk. The question is whether the institutions that house the relevant evidence, the museum databases with their unexamined multispectral datasets, the archaeological sites with their uninvestigated deeper levels, the ancient DNA repositories with their partially analysed populations, consider the questions this evidence raises worth prioritising above the institutional inertia that has kept a single sentence about a partial name confined to a methodological footnote for over a decade. The unnamed Apkallu spent his institutional existence arguing that humanity deserved to know what it was. The evidence that he was right has been accumulating in the world's cuneiform collections since the first excavation trenches opened at Nippur in 1888. What happens with it next belongs entirely to the civilization it concerns.